Sandor Clegane tasted copper in his mouth as he staggered across the blood-slick flagstones of the Red Keep's highest battlements. A dying spark of evening lingered beyond the crenellations, washing the sky with bruised violet. But the city below was already a silhouette of smoke and guttering flame. He paused, drawing a ragged breath that rasped like a whetstone down his throat. The wind carried the mingled stench of charred wood and scorched flesh, King's Landing's final evening dirge. The Hound spat, half bile, half blood, and felt a tremor ripple through him that had nothing to do with the fading pain in his ribs. He had never sought to be anyone's savior. Yet in the half-hour just past, he had done what no sworn brother of the King's Guard, no gilded knight of the realm, no spider of the court had managed. He had shoved death aside with burned hands and brute savagery, halting wildfire barrels, meant to burst across the city's heart. The pyromancer's plot, stirred by a mad queen's lingering whisper and abetted by spineless counselors, would have consumed the capital whole. He wiped a sooty forearm across his brow, smearing sweat into fresh ash. Somewhere beneath, the grotesque visage he wore since childhood glowered back, half man, half melted candle. He found no solace in saving those who had once shrunk from him. He did it because the crackle of wildfire, the shrieks of flames and dying horses, dredged up memories of seared flesh and screaming children. And he could not bear another night filled with eyes wide with fiery terror, not when those eyes might look like his own reflection in a still pool at dawn. Boots scuffed stone behind him. Sir Brienne's voice rang clear, a harsh whisper brimming with relief and awe. 7 save us, you did it. The last cask. You pitched it over the wall before it could break. Sandor grunted, refusing to turn. It's the city the 7 saved, not me. I only threw a barrel. Yet even in his growl, he heard a quiver, a sound like something fragile cracking open inside. Brienne came beside him, braced upon her sword, shoulders heaving. Her blonde hair was a ragged banner. Soot marred her cheek, but her eyes shone. I saw Lannister men falling back from the Gate of the Gods. The wildfire chain has been doused where it flows through the drains. Maesters say the fires near Flea Bottom are dying by the hour. Sandor stared past her at the winding river that caught the last sunlight in molten ribbons. The black water, glimmering like steel, unsharpened. He did not speak of the nightmares that would linger for years, how smoke lodged itself in lungs and hearts both. He knew what could not be unburned. Yet some part of him, buried beneath ruined flesh, felt a flicker of something like pride and fear, because pride was a brittle thing. Footsteps clattered, a half-dozen gold cloaks escorting Grand Maester Orwyle and Lord Davos Seaworth, both wearing expressions of stunned gratitude. The Onion Knight's weather-veined face split with a crooked smile when he caught sight of Sandor. I thought kingmakers only lived in psalms, Davos said. Seems I'm looking at one in boiled leather and ashes. Sandor barked a laugh. I'm no bloody kingmaker. I don't even like kings. Then? Perhaps, Orwyle said. But the small folk will sing your name by moonrise. They've no love for lords who would burn them in their beds, but they kneel to strength that shields. Sandor's laughter vanished like breath on winter glass. Kneel to him. He imagined grubby children chanting the Hound's verses in alleys, where rats gnawed corpses days before. The idea sickened him more than the wounds pinching his side. The Grand Maester lifted a hand to the sky, as if blessing the air. Queen Cersei vanished in the chaos. Betrayed by her own alchemists, some claim. The throne stands empty, yet we have a realm to steady. Lindum Brienne frowned. And who do you propose they seat upon it? Orwyle's gaze settled on Sandor. We stand in the presence of the man who preserved half the crown's people, whose courage outstrips the names of great houses. A king born of fire's crucible, might not such a one hold the realm's loyalty? Silence rang longer than any bell. Sandor felt blood drum in his eardrums. I'm no knight, no lord. I was a butcher, butchering for Lannister coin. You put a crown on my head and I'll cut it in halves to fit the dogs that follow me. Now. The crown is broken already, Davos murmured. Better forged anew, by honest hands. Brienne's armored palm touched Sandor's shoulder. Light, tentative. The realm needs a ruler who does not hunger for it, one who knows what fire costs. Fuck your realm. Sandor shrugged her hand away, more gentle than his words. He limped toward the stair, intending to leave them to their foolish talk. But the Red Keep's corridor ahead throbbed with torchlight and ringing steel. Word of his heroics had spread swift as wildfire might have. Servants pressed to the walls, eyes round. A stable boy knelt, tears streaking his grime. Ser Sandor. No, King Sandor. Please. My sister is trapped beneath timbers near the Street of Sisters. Only you can free. Sandor lifted a gauntleted hand. I'm not your king. But he followed the boy all the same, because he could not refuse eyes that begged deliverance from flame. Wounded ribs howled protest as he descended spiral steps 2 at a time. 3 hours later, dawn finally bled across the rooftops in muted pink, and Sandor Clegane had not stopped moving. He wrenched charred joists from collapsed dwellings, carried children on his shoulders across smoldering avenues, and shouted orders to gold cloaks too dazed to obey their captains. The city watched a giant stride through its ruin and whispered the shape of a legend before the last smoke curled into morning sky. When sun climbed fully, Brienne found him leaning against a wall not far from the Dragon Pit ruins, eyes sunken yet still alert. She bore news. The faith militant had convened outside the great Seps foundation stones and pronounced a decree. The realm delivered by the Hound shall be ruled by the Hound, if the Hound so will. Sandor scoffed. They call me dog, but expect me to herd cats. He rubbed at the old burn scars that ravaged one half of his face, feeling them pulse with remembered heat. What fool would bend knee to a face like mine? More fools than you reckon, Brienne said, gently defiant. I heard a baker declare that scars prove you've stood closer to danger than any silk court lord ever dared. They call you the Ash King already. Now, he grimaced. Fancy name for a kennel mutt. Better than fancy kings who let cities burn. She sheathed Oathkeeper. You save those who could not save themselves. Claim what follows, or another will seize it. Men far worse than you, or me. 2 days passed, marked by hammer clangs as small folk raised makeshift shelters. Rains arrived mercifully, quenching lingering embers and sweetening ash-laden air. The fleets of storms end, and the Reach drew to harbor bearing grain and citrus and hope. Lords on their decks bowed silently to a world they had not expected. Within the throne room, the Iron Throne sat jagged and unoccupied, its shadow stretching long over damp marble. Sandor stood before it while Davos Orwyle and Brienne gathered like weathered pillars at his back. The Onion Knight's voice broke the hush. Someone must climb those steps. A dog on a spikewood chair? Sandor growled. I'd rather shit molten gold. Brienne's gaze softened. Rule is more than sitting. It's setting right. She gestured toward the hall doors, where hundreds waited. A mosaic of fisherfolk, smiths, hedge knights, freedmen and women. They've had lords for centuries, didn't save them from dragons, wildfire, or cold hunger. They want someone unafraid to wade through flame. Sandor exhaled. Somewhere behind his ribs, he felt the pressure of all those eyes he'd met the night he hurled a barrel of green death into the black water. Not reverence. Hope, raw and desperate. He could crush it, walk away, vanish north. Yet hope crushed breeds despair like fly eggs in a festering wound. He'd seen what men become when despair festers. He stared at the Iron Throne's twisted swords. He remembered circling it in childhood, a Lannister pup, when Jaime gloated about how many had died forging that monstrous seat. Sandor now understood the seat's true purpose: to remind any who dared sit that no victory comes without edges, sharp enough to bleed even the victor. Every sword, every scar. His own skin bore a sword shape of memory. Perhaps that made him suited to understand what rulership costs. He grunted. Very well. Let it be known. I'll sit the throne until the realm is mended. No longer. When the city stands tall and full again, when no child fears fire, I'll step down and leave the lords to squabble. That is my bargain. Nandero. Orwyle bowed. Then bend us in blessing, your grace. The title struck like a mace head. Sandor half snorted, half coughed. But he squared shoulders, turned, and took slow, deliberate steps toward the Iron Throne. Each step echoed across the cavernous hall, the hush stretching taut. In that silence he heard distant memories. His father's laughter twisting to screams, the crackle of a brazier, the hiss of fat as flesh melted. He forced the memory back and kept climbing. At the throne's foot, he paused, laying a scarred palm upon the cold iron. Edges bit gently into his calloused flesh. He bled, just a dot of crimson that welled up, bright against dull steel. A baptism of his own making. He closed fingers, feeling the iron dig deeper, accepting the pain. Then he turned, lowered himself atop the step-welded blades and sat. A murmur swept the hall, a sound like waves striking stone. Sandor Clegane looked out across a sea of faces. Some bore house colors, Baratheon stags, Tyrell roses, even stark gray direwolves, but most wore nothing but soot-stained linen and hope. He cleared his throat. "I'm no king bred in silk," he said, voice rumbling off vaults and rafters. "My crown's the fire that scarred me. My scepter's the hammer I used to smash open casks when wildfire came for you. I'll rule only so long as needed. I'll lay no silk taxes upon you, nor tilt at faraway wars. We'll rebuild these walls, feed each belly that hungers, bury our dead proper, and drive fear from our streets. When that's done, I'll pass this chair to one you choose, someone who understands what fire does to flesh." "Ma'am." He leaned forward, dark eyes glinting beneath a battered brow. "But hear me clear. If any man, high or low, sets flame to innocence again, I'll feed him to the very fires he stokes. I'm the last dragon to burn this city, because I'll burn any bastard plans before they kindle. That's my decree." Bender. Silence held a heartbeat longer. Then a roar flooded the hall. Not of polished boots on marble but calloused palms beating breastplates, wooden clogs stomping flagstones, voices hoarse with belief. They cried the Ash King. They cried the Hound. The very walls trembled. Sandor felt it resonate through blade-forged iron into his spine. He did not smile, not truly. Yet something eased in the lines of his ruined face, a slackening, as if a bandage unwrapped after years of too tight binding. For once, no lord commanded him, no queen dangled promise of gold. He was beholden only to the vow he'd set. Mend what flame had broken. In the weeks that followed, King Sandor, though he forbade anyone to use the honorific outside formal summons, strode the streets daily. He wore no crown, only a black cloak seared at the hem, and carried a warhammer taken from the Red Keep's vault. With each dawn he met builders at collapsed tenements, lifting stones alongside them until sweat pooled in the hollows of his burned scars. By noon he judged petitions in the throne room, settling disputes in blunt sentences that cut through layered lies. When merchants complained of thieves, he trudged to the wharf and hauled the ringleader by ear to face his victims. "Justice's teeth must close swift," he told Davos privately, "else rot sets in the bite." Word spread to every alley. The new king had no patience for bribes or pomp. Children began to chase him, calling him Dog King, giggling when he barked in mock annoyance. Flea-bottom mothers offered loaves as thanks. He waved payment off but accepted the bread, breaking it with them on doorsteps. By full moon, hunger in the worst districts had lessened. The grain stores Davos, arranged from Storm's End, flowed steady, and the riverlands reopened trade routes. Yet not all knelt willingly. Lord Giles Rosby sneered at the idea of serving a burned brute. He withheld taxes, plotting alliance with the remnant forces loyal to Cersei. Sandor answered by riding to Rosby Castle at dawn with 6 companions and the city garrison moving by barge behind. They found the gates open and servants cheering. Lord Giles had fled by night. Sandor commandeered Rosby's granaries, distributing barley and oats to outlying villages where winter vegetables had failed. The gesture won him quiet allegiance of smallfolk far beyond the crownlands, but sharpened envy among highborn. A council of discontent formed at Maidenpool, nobles mumbling that a dog could not wear dragon's mantle. They summoned mercenaries from Tyrosh, hoping to retake the capital under pretense of restoring order. Sandor stood atop the mudgate when their sails appeared on horizon. Instead of summoning bannermen, He opened the gates himself, riding out with 100 gold cloaks and 300 volunteer pikemen, fisherfolk, tanners, seamstresses. They met the sellsword vanguard in the reeds west of the city. Battle sang and bought. Sandor's hammer blurred, crushing helms like eggshells. He fought at front, half-shorn beard matted with sweat and blood. Beside him Brienne slashed a gleaming arc, Oathkeeper catching dawn's light. Small folk held the line with farm glaives, rallying to the Hound's guttural shouts. When Taroshi captains realized, they fought peasants led by a king who killed at vanguard. Their resolve cracked. By dusk, the mercenary host withdrew, leaving broken banners among trampled lilies. Sandor returned to the city gates splattered in gore, greeted by cheers. But he saw behind each cheer a grieving face. For 50 of his volunteers lay unbreathing amid reeds. He ordered wagons to bring the dead home, decreed that no family would pay a copper for burial or for bread in mourning. In secret, he asked Brienne to carve a stone slab naming each fallen soul. They set it on the hill of Rhaenys, where the old dragon skulls once glared. Now, plain names overlooked the city, an army of memory to shame any who forgot what common folk bled for. Seasons turned. The red keep's scorched walls were replastered and painted, not in Lannister crimson, but muted slate matching Sandor's cloak. A small council formed of Brienne, Davos, and Orwyle, joined by Gendry Waters, raised to Lord of the Blackwater for forging plowshares that tilled the burned fields outside the capital. Under their guidance, King's Landing grew humbler yet stronger. Aqueducts rebuilt, bathhouses reopened, new cobblestones laid along the street of Flower. Fleas yielded to mortar and proper drains. Through it all, Sandor refused any coronation feast. Feasts are for days after war is won, he said. Our war is living. Still, every man reaches twilight. 4 years after the night of wildfire, Sandor awoke tasting blood again, but this time, it came from within. A cough racked him, deep and hollow. The maesters muttered of iron lung and scar tissue rot, too many nights inhaling ash. He brushed them off, rising each dawn though his steps slowed. Lines scratched deeper around his eyes, gray streaked his beard. One evening on the wall above the Dragon Gate, Brienne found him staring south, wind tousling his cloak. "You're weakening," she said softly. He admitted. "Time's hammer's heavier than mine." She rested gloved hands on the parapet. "The city stands tall. Harvests fill the granaries. The Faith, the Northern Wardens, even Dorne recognize your decree. Perhaps your bargain is fulfilled." Sandor breathed, feeling the air cool against half-scarred cheek. He thought of his vow, to rule only until fear of fire no longer ruled them. He had not heard a wildfire whisper in years. Children skipped across courtyards at dusk, without glancing skyward for cinder glow. They feared other things, tax collectors, heartbreak, the ordinary pains of life, but not flame. "A king who lingers past his time," he said, "rots like old meat. I'd sooner feed myself to wolves than let that stink cling to me." "What then?" "A council to choose among great houses." Sandor shook his head. "No more great houses born to rule by accident of cunt and cock. We'll let guilds and septons, sailors and teachers, choose a speaker each. 12 of them will sit as wardens moot. They'll pick a chair among themselves, and that one will rule. If he grows fat on power, the moot can toss him out." "Madame?" Brienne considered, iron eyes gleaming in torchlight. At last she smiled, small and weary. "The realm will name the moot after you. Sandor's Circle." "Better than Ashy Dog Dome," he muttered. Yet warmth flickered in his chest. The day arrived warm and clear. On the plaza before the sept-white steps, thousands gathered. Sandor wore no crown, only a plain leather jerkin, his warhammer strapped to a simple baldric. He ascended a wooden scaffold, coughing slightly, and faced the crowd. He spoke of 4 years' labor and the circle of 12 newly chosen. Blacksmiths, scribes, dockwomen, healers, none with sigils more noble than calloused hands. He declared them guardians of the realm, and himself a soldier returned to simple rank. Then, In the hush that followed, he lifted his hammer one final time and flung it from the stage. It clattered on stone, the thunder of ending. "I was forged by fire against my will," he said, voice hoarse but clear. "I held this city so no more would burn. You, each of you, hold it now. Keep it." He stepped down and walked through parted sea of onlookers, who touched his arms, his cloak, murmuring blessings. Once beyond the milling throng, he mounted a dun horse waiting by the gate. Brienne stood beside it, helm tucked beneath her arm. "Where will you go?" she asked. "North, maybe. Somewhere the air's sharp enough to scrape these lungs clean. Might build a farm, might drink myself dead." She grinned. "Send word if you plant turnips. I'll taste them and tell you they're half raw." Sandor swung into the saddle, joints aching but heart strangely light. He looked once more at the city rising beyond its walls, cranes hoisting slate, banners fluttering in sunlight, smoke not of war but cook-fires. He nodded, a mute farewell, then spurred the horse toward the King's Road. Behind him, bells tolled, not mournful but bright, as if each iron tongue sang a different note of the same chord, the new realm's first anthem. Sandor did not glance back. He carried the sound within. Years later, travelers at roadside inns would tell tales of the Ash King, who ruled without a crown and walked away without bloodshed. Some said he tamed wolves in the far north, others that he died quietly in a field of white flowers, where no fires ever burned. Yet whenever wildfire barrels rumbled in nightmares, children sat up and whispered that if blaze ever came again, the Hound would rise from ashes to hurl it back into darkness. Because once, when all seemed doomed to green flame, a scarred dog barked at death and made it heal. Oh. Blind white light scattered in ghostly columns through the towering pines, as Sandor Clegane urged his dun gelding onto the narrow trail that climbed from the King's Road into the northern foothills. The song of bells far behind was a memory already fading beneath the sharp air that filled his lungs like cold iron filings. Each breath stung, but it was a pain he savored. The maesters had warned him the scar-stiff tissue in his chest would either knit or kill depending on the purity of the winds he drew. Down south, laden with the perpetual smoke of cook fires and forges, every inhale had felt like chewing soot. Here it tasted of snow melt and pine resin. A bite fierce enough to make a man feel newly born. For 3 days he pressed northward, sleeping hard beneath the fraying cloak Brienne had draped over his shoulders after their last wordless farewell. In his dreams he walked the Red Keep's corridors still, hammer in hand, hunting sparks before they could grow into conflagrations. He woke each dawn drenched in sweat that steamed in the chill, heart pounding to the phantom clang of bells that would never again summon him to judge and build and bury. Yet with every mile the weight of those bells eased. Beyond the towering neck, he passed clusters of small farms ringed by dry stone walls. Lanterns flickered behind frosted panes, and folk glanced from doorways at the lone rider whose burnt visage caught moonlight like molten copper. None recognized the scars as belonging to a former king. To them he was only another big man seeking the solace of the northern wilds, and he did not volunteer otherwise. He helped mend a broken wagon axle in exchange for hot turnip stew, slew a pair of brigands who tried to waylay a shepherd girl on the Barrowlands track, then accepted a wool blanket and nothing more. He found that without crown or counsel, each kindness tasted cleaner, and each blow he struck rang truer than any deed he'd managed within stone walls gilded by duty. On the 9th night, snow flurried through a waning moon. He took shelter under the eaves of a ruined holdfast and built a modest fire, coaxing dry wood from a shattered gate. Flames licked stone and sent sparks twisting upward. He studied them, feeling the old gut-tightening dread that fire had always stirred, but now layered with a stranger emotion, something like reverence. For all its terror, fire had forged him twice. First in his brother's cruelty, then in the moment he'd hurled death's green echo into the river. Without flame, he would still be a kennel brute sniffing Lannister leavings. Without flame, there would be no Ash King, no circle. Pain and purpose were twin edges on the same sword. He slept fitful and woke to find a gaunt shape crouched at the edge of firelight. A direwolf, vast and silver gray, one ear torn, eyes gleaming yellow. Sandor's hand went to the dagger at his belt, but something in the beast's posture. Shoulders level, snout low but not barred, hinted at a greeting rather than threat. They regarded one another through a veil of gently falling snow. "Go on then," he muttered. "Plenty of bones left from my supper." The wolf padded forward, sniffed the sticks, and nudged aside a charred mutton knuckle. It crunched, gaze never leaving his ruined face. Sandor eased back against the wall, heart thudding slow and steady. He had known only one other beast so unafraid of scars. The little she-wolf from the Trident who'd grown into a woman swinging needle in a Bravosi courtyard. The memory sparked an unexpected warmth. When the direwolf finished, it turned north and paused, as if beckoning. Sandor rose, joints cracking. "You want company?" A huff like a half-laugh escaped the wolf before it trotted off between the pines. Sandor banked his coals, packed his gear, and followed at a respectful distance. Unsure why, but certain some shared destination waited. They crossed the last river after 2 days, the wolf seldom far from view, though it hunted on silent paws, returning at dusk to circle Sandor's camp before settling down to watch the night. He grew accustomed to its presence, speaking little but thinking often of the girl, who once named him Dog and left him dying at the foot of a hill. Perhaps she too ran these woods with a beast for company. On the evening of the 12th day, aurora ribbons shimmered along the northern horizon. The wolf halted upon a ridgeline and loosed a low whine, tail swishing. Sandor approached and saw a dim camp down in the vale. 3 tents, a small fire, and the glint of steel. Riders patrolled the perimeter, armored, disciplined, not brigands. Sigils flickered when their cloaks caught the flame's glow, a gray direwolf on white. Stark men, then. Sandor's chest tightened. He considered veering wide. He had no wish to answer questions or kneel to any lordling who might take umbrage at an ex-king treading their woods unannounced. Yet the direwolf trotted downhill boldly. With a grunt, he followed. If this was some snare laid by fate, best spring it openly. He was done skulking. A sentry spotted him and called, "Halt!" Another notch of tension vibrated the night as archers drew. The dire wolf trotted straight past the checkpoint, a shade melting into camp. Murmurs rose. Sandor lifted empty hands. "I'm a traveler with coin enough to buy a meal," he called, voice steady. "I've no quarrel." A tall figure strode from the largest tent, lamplight trailing. She wore dark riding leathers, a shadowy clasp at her throat. Long hair, almost black, rippled loose in the wind. At her side she carried a slender blade whose scabbard bore the shape of a running wolf wrapped in thorny flowers. She stopped 5 paces from Sandor, and her face, thrown into relief by firelight, resolved into the chill poise of Arya Stark. No words at first, only the measured rise and fall of her breath. The same rhythm he'd once watched as she lay wounded in the rubble of an inn, as ribs fluttered under torn tunic, and he prayed to gods he scorned that she'd keep living because he could not bear to drag yet another corpse behind him. She'd lived. She'd thrived. And now she studied him without a flicker of surprise, as though time bent naturally to bring them back into one another's orbit. "Sandor Clegane," she said, tone flat as steel over water. "Ariadot. He dipped his head, not quite bowing, but acknowledging the chasm between who she'd been and who stood before him. "Your mutt led me here. Figured I might claim a bowl of stew for services rendered." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Nymeria leads no one. She invites. Did you accept?" "I did." He glanced toward the shadows where the direwolf now lay at the edge of camp, proudly licking her paws. Couldn't very well refuse such hospitality. Arya turned to the soldiers. "Lower bows." They obeyed. She motioned him to the fire. "You look thinner. Age suits you." "Nem? Ni. And burning cities, apparently." He settled on a log, flexing sore knees. A stew pot simmered. A young guard ladled him a portion. Sandor tasted it. Salt and venison with wild mushrooms. Food better than any king's feast, because his hunger was honest. Arya sat opposite. Word reached Winterfell, she said quietly, that King's Landing's rebuild thrives. They called the ruler Ash King. I never imagined the man under that crown was you, until ravens described a scarred face that scorned silks. He swallowed another spoonful. Didn't wear a crown, didn't much care for the name. I'm done with ruling now. The circle runs the roost. I read the charter. 12 seats, all common-born save the healer's apprentice. It's impressive, Sandor grunted. Impressive would be if they last a decade without strangling one another. Arya poked the fire. Sparks lifting. I'm escorting a dozen settlers to the gifts. Small folk who lost harvests when Long Lake flooded. They'll farm near Last Hearth if soil proves kind. She looked up, eyes bright. They could use someone who knows how to build stone houses that won't burn. Subtle girl. Woman. Her smile sharpened. But yes. Subtle like a hammer. Ride with us tomorrow. Walk the plots. Give advice. You'll earn fresh bread, maybe even peace. A pause softer. You saved 500,000 people, Sandor. Let yourself save a dozen more. He studied the spoon in his scarred hand, noticing how fire gleamed along the bent metal. In King's Landing he'd driven piles, measured footings, scolded masons, skills he never knew he owned until necessity made him teacher. Part of him missed the clatter of hammers and laughter among laborers. Perhaps one more stretch of building before the grave wouldn't hurt. I'll look, he said, but if they burn their own roofs cooking supper, I'm riding on. Bear. They spoke until the fire collapsed into ruby ember, trading stripped-down tales of intervening years. Arya told of distant seas, pale cities, a narrow channel where seals barked beneath cliffs. Sandor recounted the Taroshi siege, the Circle's first quarrels, the names etched on the hill of Rhaenys. Neither mentioned the night she'd left him bleeding on the banks of the Trident. That wound had scabbed over long ago, each of them knowing the debt was settled the moment he chose to hurl a cask of wildfire rather than flee. Some balances only fate could tally. For half a year Sandor remained with the settlers, shaping homesteads and irrigation ditches in the tundra-browned earth south of the wall's remains. He felled pines alongside loggers, instructing them to char the outer beam ends before setting into stone footings, a trick he'd learned reading Old Town treatises Davos brought to council. He discovered a knack for driving teams, assigning tasks by talent, calming disputes before they flared. When a blight struck early barley shoots, he borrowed scattering fans from a lumber mill, taught villagers to dust ash and lie over furrows, to kill the fungus, the same ash that once choked his lungs now serving to safeguard crops. The labor left him bone-weary yet strangely replenished. Lungs ached less each dawn. Scars pale lines under the midnight sun. He scarcely noticed when a full year slid by, punctuated only by seasons of planting and harvest. He hammered door hinges while children perched on his shoulders. He hunted elk with Arya in autumn fog. He wintered in a communal hall where the roof he'd designed shed snow in satisfying avalanches. Nymeria ranged at the forest edge, occasionally padding to his side with snarling lungs full of crisp air. In waking quiet, he sometimes stroked her fur, marveling at warmth beneath thick silver-guard hairs. She accepted, neither tame nor feral, simply bound by choice as he was. But peace never lingers where old swords hang, and news travels on frost-bitten winds. It began with a raven clawing at the coop lattice one dawn in late frost. The parchment bore the sigil of Lord Robert Glover, now Warden of the North. Rogue host riding south under banners of Rosby and a dozen disaffected Crownlands houses. Circle, pleads, aid. War may reach capital before winter solstice. Through the curling ink Sandor heard the bells again, faint but urgent. He carried the letter to Arya, who frowned. If those lords topple the circle, the small folk lose their voice. Years of work undone. I left them the hammer, Sandor muttered. "But the hammer alone can't hold a door if men stop bracing it." He looked across the valley where sun-struck roofs he'd raised. The settlers he'd guarded were hardy now, self-sufficient. His promise to Arya's folk felt complete. "Suppose I must fetch the mutts their master one last time." Nymeria lifted her head and howled, echo rolling like distant thunder. Arya placed a hand on Sandor's braced forearm. "You taught them how to build. Now teach them how to stand. I'll ride with you. Then throw. Your people can spare me." Her smile held the glint of a long knife. "Besides, I owe those Crownlands lords a few memories of Harrenhal." Within a day, they set out, Sandor on his dun gelding, Arya astride a lean silver mare, Nymeria loping ahead. They cut across the King's Road, pace relentless, pausing only to water on icy stream banks. Each league south felt heavier. Shadows of past burdens creeping alongside. Yet he was not the dog bound to Lannister chains, nor the hammer-wielding monarch walled in stone. He was the builder, the teacher, the man fire had tempered. And fire, he knew, could serve as shield as much as blade. They reached the Trident's fords weeks later to find war-trampled fields and smoke drifting on the horizon. Refugees clutched bundles of meager goods, while columns of armored riders swept past under dusk banners. Rosby's colors mixed with Taroshi Sellsword's once more. This time better paid, their ranks swollen by bitter knights who bristled at the notion of coopers debating taxes alongside barons. The army marched on King's Landing, reports said, promising to restore proper station. Sandor's gaze hardened. Proper station means small folk trampled under hoof. He turned to Arya. "The circle will not have numbers to repel this host. Then we bleed the host before it reaches the walls." She returned, eyes alight. They rode at twilight to Rivergate, where tanners hammered hides and smiths quenched plowshares. Sandor stood upon the weeping willow stump at Market Square and called for volunteers. He spoke plain, of a power won and wielded by the many, now threatened by the few. Of houses long feathered with privilege seeking to reclaim dominion. Of walls that would stand if every commoner laid one stone, or tumble if each waited for another. By nightfall, 200 Riverlanders shouldered spears. By dawn, thrice that number followed, pitchforks and long knives glinting. Not a banner among them save rough-work shields painted with wheat sheaves, hammers, quills. They marched at Sandor's back along the Gold Road, meeting other bands raised by circle emissaries. Farmers, barge captains, septus, even a troop of mummers turned archers. Arya drilled them in loose skirmish tactics learned in Bravos. Sandor forged discipline, teaching when to push, when to hold. Yet numbers alone could not offset armored heavy cavalry. Near Bitterbridge they scouted the enemy's main strength, 8,000, half-mounted knights, flanked by sellsword pikes. Overwhelming. But the Ash King-turned builder studied the earth, noting gullies, dried irrigation canals, the broken dam upstream where Blackwater tributary wound. An idea struck, bright as ember. For 2 days they worked by moonlight, shovels scratching, stakes hammered to hold reed mats, bundling tall grasses with rope. When the enemy vanguard arrived, they found the valley bottom deceptively serene. Sun glared off, trampled wheat stubble, wind moaned. As Rosby's horn sounded the charge, Sandor gave his own, 2 long blasts. Volunteers hauled rope lines, hidden stakes snapped. Reed mats holding back pooled river water tore free. A wall of muddy torrent poured into the flat, turning firm ground to sucking bog within moments. Chargers floundered, hooves swallowed. Knights toppled, armor dragging them into mire. Panic rippled. Sellsword pikes buckled, archers slipped in slime. From ridges villagers loosed volleys of jagged arrows. Nymeria led a pack of northern wolves released from carts, darting through chaos, sowing terror among mounts. Sandor waded knee-deep in sludge, swinging a refurbished warhammer, lighter than his old one, but still enough to stove helm plates. Arya danced atop collapsing wagons, needle flickering like pale lightning. Where knights' lances pinned her down, volunteers with pitchforks swarmed, dragging nobles under brown water. No formal battle this, raw, brutal, marsh-born slaughter, but it broke an army bent on subjugation. At dusk trumpets sputtered to silence. Rosby's banners lay in the mud, their silk sodden. Lord Giles' second cousin, now commander, surrendered on trembling knees. Sandor pulled him upright by gorget and said, "Voice a quiet stone. You marched to choke a city you never bled to build. Look around. Common earth swallowed you whole. Remember this taste whenever power tempts you." He released the man, who staggered away coughing swamp water. Losses among the volunteer levy were grave. 200 dead, thrice that wounded. Sandor ordered wagons turned to ambulances, Arya overseeing poultice lines. At midnight, he walked among the bodies laid out on reed thatch, pressing a hand to each brow, whispering something between a prayer and a promise. He carried no crown, yet those who watched thought him every inch a king, because he bowed his head lower than any mourner. Word of the rout raced ahead. When Sandor's host approached King's Landing's outskirts, the circle had already mustered Baker militias atop rebuilt walls. They greeted him with astonished joy. He found Davos older, beard gleaming silver, still keeper of the East Tower. Brienne arrived the next morning leading a contingent of Stormland's archers, armor dented from her own rearguard skirmishes against opportunistic sellswords. The reunion was sparse on ceremony. Clasped forearms, half smiles, a grunt or two. But hearts warmed around the quiet assurance that the realm they tended still held. The circle convened in the throne room, its iron chair now roped off, a relic rather than seat. 12 members stood, their garb plain. A stonemason, a washerwoman, a scribe missing 3 fingers, a Mander Bay fisher, whose accent rolled like tides. They listened as Sandor described the battle and the cost. When he finished, they offered him the chair once more, an emergency warrant to guide the realm through threat. He shook his head. "I held it until fear burned out of your marrow," he said, voice low but unyielding. "Now fear comes from men, not flame. Men you can meet yourselves. I'll lend hammer and arm where needed, but the chair belongs to the circle. Prove you deserve it." Benderol. In the weeks that followed, the circle did. They dispatched tribunals to try captured lords, commuting sentences where remorse reigned, stripping lands where pride festered. They levied restoration fines, dedicating coin to the widow's fund for volunteer dead. They ratified a charter guaranteeing any lord who raised arms against commons would forfeit right to seat in council. Sandor watched from the gallery, nodding when measures passed, scowling when rhetoric meandered toward vanity. Yet each day the voice of the fisher or the candlemaker rose equal to that of the learned scribe, and he found satisfaction deeper than any acclamation hurled at his scarred face. When the tribunals ended and roads quieted, Sandor prepared to leave again. Brienne found him in the stables, fitting saddle straps. "Don't," she said simply. "You know I cannot sit idle in marble halls." He checked the bit, tightening a buckle. "I wasn't asking you to stay in halls. I was asking you to stay where people can see what a free man looks like after power has let go." "Mensarwend," he considered, stroking the gelding's neck. "I'll wander the crownlands, help finish dikes the flood season demands. After that, maybe west to Chilanisport Smiths that iron shoes last better when double clenched." He glanced up at her. "People will see." She smiled, eyes crinkling. "Mind you send ravens. Arya has riders to train, and shall complain if the great Ash King vanishes without leaving map crumbs." He swung into the saddle, grimacing at a lance of hip pain. "Tell her the ash blows where wind wills." Brienne stepped back. "Winds are fickle, but stone remembers those who lay foundations." He rode through the city's outer gate at sunrise. Children played beside canal locks he'd designed years before, their laughter chiming across water. A baker, setting trays of morning loaves, bowed as he passed. He touched 2 fingers to brow in return. No horns blared, no banners unfurled. Just a nod between builder and city. Along the river, he saw masons laying courses for a new bridge. Their plumb lines sagged wrong. He drew rein, dismounted, and walked over. The foreman blinked at the sight of a hulking stranger adjusting stones. Then recognition dawned. Sandor said nothing of titles, He only showed them how to wedge shale chips, how to test a span with weighted barrels before setting mortar. Hours bled away. Sun climbing, tools clinking. He felt alive among dust and sweat. When the bridge's first arch stood firm, he washed hands in the river. Water ran clear over scarred skin. Across its surface a reflected face met his gaze. The burn scars, the flecks of gray in beard, the eyes once haunted. He looked strangely whole, as if each line etched by flame found balance in lines etched by wind and laughter. He splashed water on both cheeks, stood, and resumed the road. Years later, chroniclers would note 3 distinct eras since the fall of the Dragon Kings: the War of Five, the Interregnum of Crows, and the Age of the Circle. But among dock taverns and high-born salons alike, folk preferred a simpler tale, a story of the Dog King who saved a city, then gave its keys back to paupers. They spoke of the battle of the muddy field where a bog swallowed lances, of the turning of the throne from iron to relic, of the direwolf guide who chose a burnt man as companion. Scholars argued dates, singers embroidered feats, yet all agreed on the ending none had witnessed: an aging giant laying the last keystone of a bridge before wandering down a sun-dappled lane toward villages that needed walls, roofs, and faith in themselves. Some said he died on a western cliff at sunset, hammer planted upright like a gravestone, gazing at the sea's blue flame. Others claimed they saw him decades later near Dorne, teaching children to shape adobes that kept out desert heat. No bard could pin his final breath. But whenever a fire threatened to overrun thatch-roof towns, whenever a lord's tax collectors arrived with torches, small folk whispered of a dog-faced man who might appear without banner or fanfare, seize the torch, and fling it into a river, then vanish before dawn. And so the legend of Sandor Clegane endured, not as a king enthroned in stone, but as a walking testament that crowns need not weigh more than the hand willing to lay them down. On spring nights when auroras shimmered faintly above the crownlands, children clustered along the hill of Rainies to trace weather-worn names on the stone slab of the fallen volunteers. They lit lanterns shaded in green glass, not to summon wildfire, but to honor the flames quenched by courage. And if one lantern flickered unexpectedly bright, older folk smiled and said the Ash King's spirit had leaned close, checking that the mortars still held. Oh, ka, and Indain. A single gull wheeled in the washed-out sky as spring's first thaw loosened the road to Maidenpool. Hoofbeats splashed through brown meltwater, and the townsfolk who chanced to look up from their morning errands saw a big stoop-shouldered rider approaching at an amble. He wore a patched cloak the color of wet bark and a broad-brimmed straw hat that hid most of his hair, though not the half-ruined cheek and jaw below. A pack mule plodded 2 lengths behind, panniers rattling with hammers, chisels, lengths of chain, iron nails, and coils of freshly tarred rope. The rider's name, that most remembered only long after he had passed, was Sandor Clegane. Yet he answered these days to Grey Hand, or simply the Mason, for the Circle had never managed to keep him penned beneath any title more gilded. Maidenpool was still licking wounds from the winter nor'easter that had torn its slate roofs in jagged patches and snapped the harbor wharf like a matchstick. Wagons of limestone bound for the keep wall now lay half-submerged in muck at the edge of town, and a thin crowd of carpenters and cooper apprentices milled with uncertain purpose amid wind-felled elm trunks. When the big stranger swung down, no trumpets sounded, no alderman stepped forth to greet him. The Circle's road wardens had sent no proclamation ahead. In time, word would spread that the Ash King walked the lanes again. But for the moment, he was only a weary traveler studying cracked foundations the way a healer studies a fevered brow. He strode toward the toppled wagon and stooped. The teamster began apologizing before he knew why. "Road's too soft yet, sir. We'll fetch draft oxen once the new keep smith mends." "Oxen'll mangle the ruts worse," Sandor interrupted. He pried away a splintered sideboard, testing the stone blocks with bare fingers. "Night's frost still hiding under this top crust. You want flat sledges, 6 men with levers, and skids greased with mutton fat. I'll show you a trick for laying corduroy to spread the weight." The teamster blinked, then blurted thanks. Sandor hitched his mule to the edge of the square, unbundled a narrow-bladed spud bar, and within moments 6 volunteers were helping lever each limestone slab onto makeshift sleds cut from the broken wagon bed. No one thought to ask his right to give orders. The authority in his scarred hands proved enough. By afternoon, the stone reached the keep gate. By dusk, he had 40 townsfolk felling the rest of the storm-shattered elms, not for firewood, but for a ribbed breakwater he envisioned stretching out to sea to blunt the autumn tides. Hammers rang until torchlight wavered on Salt Spray, and Maidenpool's harbor, so long resigned to half measures and corroded nails, found itself humming again with purpose. That evening, over trencher bowls of peppered haddock, the castle steward finally recognized their guest when firelight caught the left side of his face. He went rushing off to pen a raven, which winged south toward the capital before moonrise. By dawn, rumors raced faster than wings. The Dog King had returned, carrying only rope and stubbornness, ready to mend whatever lay broken. 3 weeks later, in the candlebright council rotunda of King's Landing, the circle's 12 stewards listened to the steward's raven with equal parts relief and concern. Relief, because news of Ironborn raids along the westerland coast had unsettled every granary clerk in the city. Concern, because if Sandor Clegane meant to chase off those reavers single-handed, he might well die in the attempt, and the realm could ill afford to lose the one symbol that still bound fisherfolk and hedge knights under a single weathered banner. Brienne of Tarth leaned a scarred elbow on the oaken table. Years as marshal had silvered her temples, but purpose still shone fierce behind blue eyes. "Send riders," she urged. "Ask him to lend counsel at least." Ironborn longships probed the rushy shore and claimed they found caches of the Mad Queen's wildfire in the tidal caves. If they control that fire? Davos Seaworth, older still and half-deaf in one ear from the muddy field cannonades, let out a low whistle. Wildfire in Ironborn hands is salt and storm over every port south of the Arbor. We need the man who knows wildfire better than any maester alive. The circle voted without dissent. 2 ravens winged north, but the road wardens who followed found only an empty harbor and a hastily built breakwater already resisting high surf. Greyhand had gone east with the dawn, so the town gossips said, trundling rope and chisels toward the Kingswood. The Kingswood stretched thick and indifferent a day's ride from the old Blackwater rushlands. Among the twisted oaks and ironwoods lurked half-forgotten ruins. Watchtowers, smugglers' vaults, pyromancers' follies sealed when the Targaryen kings fell. In one such ruin, an ivy-strangled, keep the alchemists once christened cooled crucible, Sandor now stood ankle-deep in debris, breathing a slow rhythm to steady the ache in his ribs. Pallid green crystal dusted the cracked flagstones. Wildfire sediment. Even after decades, the faint scent of acrid resin lingered. Behind him clattered 2 apprentices from the Guild of Torchbearers, lads barely 20 who had met him on the Rosewad when he commandeered their cart of iron cauldrons. He'd explained little, only that they carried the right tools for a wrong danger. Now they knelt, wide-eyed, as he pried a stone slab loose to reveal a narrow cistern lined with lead. 10 ceramic spheres lay nested inside, stoppered with wax seals etched in Valyrian glyphs. Wildfire bombs, small enough to throw from deck rails. Sandor exhaled through his nose. The Ironborn scouts who'd broken the outer gate had looted nothing, but they'd spread word up coast of dragonfire buried under moss. Those words alone were flint and tinder. Reavers would come in force once they learned how easily green fire could chew through oak hulls. "Wax looks brittle," he muttered. "One jolt, and she leaks. We pour each globe into sandpits, mix lye until it clumps, then flood with brine. You brought brine." The taller apprentice swallowed hard. "4 casks, sir. But will that kill it? My master swears wildfire sleeps centuries waiting for." "It dreams," Sandor corrected, unslinging his mallet. "Dreams of burning. We aim to give it dull dreams and no spark." For 2 days they labored in the overgrown courtyard, carving trenches, lining them with river sand carted in burlap sacks. At sundown the second evening, Arya Stark rode in astride her silver mare, a dust veil torn behind her. She dismounted wordlessly, unslung a satchel of clay vials, and set them beside the trenches. "Quicklime? Crushed chalk? Ox Gull. Her gray eyes met Sandor's with flint understanding. She'd chased his trail from Maidenpool on Nymeria's silent nudge. Bringing the caustics Davos' letter claimed were vital. They worked through moonrise. Wildfire hissed when wax seals parted, vapor curling like ghost fingers. They poured, they stirred with hawthorn poles. They'd later burn to cinders. They flooded pits until a dull khaki scum formed. By dawn the last sphere lay inert, its danger spent. Sandor watched the color fade, felt the old tremor of childhood flames loosen in his chest. But the ruins' mossy battlements gave sudden answer. A horn blast, deep and guttural. 3 ironborn skiffs knifed up the nearby creek. Black sails furled as they pulled through the reeds. Knotted men leapt over gunwales, axes raised. Their captain, broad, bearded, cloaked in eelskin, shouted that the fire belonged to the drowned god now, and so too would the blood of any who kept it. Sandor planted himself in the ragged archway, hammer across his thighs. Arya melted into the ivy shadows with needle. The 2 apprentices huddled behind the lye barrels. Axes met iron. Sandor's first swing shattered a shield boss, sent splinters wheeling. He fought with the slow economy of age. 1 step, 1 breath, 1 blow that finished what it started. Every strike rang inside his skull like memory's own anvil. Green fire roaring, children screaming. But this time no cask rolled loose. No coward king ordered city gates barred. Only steel and wool decided. Arya danced among oak roots, severing hamstrings, whispering death-catch names. Nymeria lunged from brush to drag 2 reavers into ferns before vanishing again. When the skirmish ended, 12 ironborn lay strewn like cut kelp, the rest fleeing in a panicked slog downstream. Sandor pressed a palm to his side. A dented pauldron bruised ribs anew, but no bones cracked. He turned to the apprentices. "Fetch pitch," he said. "We'll seal the trench, mark the ruin with skull runes so no fool digs again." The taller lad scraped courage to ask, "Why not tell the circle to guard it?" Sandor shook his head. "Fear breeds curiosity. Better skeleton myths than maps." Arya rinsed needle and rainwater from a crumbled gargoyle's belly. "Maps fear. None of it stops greed long," she said. "No," he agreed. "But every year we keep the world from burning is a year someone learns how not to set it aflame." The high tide moot convened that summer on Driftmark, neutral ground where salt wind scoured old grudges clean. Lords from Bear Island to Old Town assembled in a barn-walled hall overlooking chalk cliffs. The circle, anxious to show unity with lords who still held banner rights, sent Brienne, Davos, and the fisherwoman, Lessa Tide. Sandor and Arya arrived by fishing skiff 2 days late, clothes still streaked with Kingswood mud dye. They refused Chamberlain finery. Sandor sat in the rear, arms folded, listening as Valerian envoys and gull-voiced rivermen debated reprisals against the Ironborn. Gold, galleys, hostages. Each plan sauntered forward, tripping on pride. When voices rose to near shouting, Lessa Tide stood and asked whether any soul present could name how many villages had lost boats already. Silence thickened, for few lords counted fisher shacks beyond tax rolls. Then Sandor rose. 26, he said, voice low but carrying. I walked, 3. Saw charred nets, lobster pots cracked like skulls. One widow kept her husband's left boot because the right still smoked. He swung a scarred hand toward the great doors. You'll weigh silver chains and hostage sons while small folk salt meat with tears. End the raids first, then squabble. A ripple moved through the benches. Not awe, recognition, as though the very timber remembered his footsteps from the days he'd refused a crown. The moot voted, and within an hour a joint fleet chartered. 30 Windwitch-class galleys under Tarth's Blue Star, 15 Arbor wine haulers refit with mantlets, 8 Stormlands river patrols. Sandor declined command, nominating Brienne. She accepted, but her first order was that Sandor serve as builder and advisor on coastal defenses, for even a fleet needs safe harbors between sorties. Summer blurred into long, salt-sprayed weeks. Sandor traveled headland to headland, laying beacons of green burn resin, an innocuous flame visible for leagues. No wildfire's doom, just bright dog stars guiding fleets to hidden coves. At salt pans he taught potters to cast swivel-mounted ballistae gears. At Duskendale he showed millwrights how to notch pine spars, so sails could reef fast in rising squalls. Whalers from the Broken Arm swore the big scarred man could smell rot in timbers before any worm sign emerged. He carried no writ, but the one etched in memory: keep the realm from burning, one plank at a time. On an evening thick with thunderheads, he and Arya pitched camp atop a chalk bluff south of Cracklaw. Below, the joint fleet's lanterns bobbed like a second constellation. Rain spat softly. Arya sharpened a throwing knife while Nymeria gnawed deerbone. "You pushed too hard," she said without glancing. "That cough's worse." Sandor snorted. "Stones don't set themselves. Neither do hearts. What happens if yours cracks like that foxed wagon you fixed in Maidenpool?" He considered the horizon, where lightning flickered purple through clouds. "Then you'll patch the crack." "I might." She sheathed the knife. "But the realm deserves more than mended ruins and battle tales. It needs teachers trained to build after we're gone. The Circle funds guild schools," he said. "Draft halls won't matter if the teachings die with the name Clegane. Write them down." He grimaced. Writing always scraped his temper raw. Quills felt fragile in hands shaped for hammer hafts. "Not a maester." "Doesn't matter. I'll scribe. Speak, and I'll ink." He grunted agreement more to end the lecture than out of conviction. Yet 2 nights later, she pressed parchment and raven quill into his calloused midst. And so by low firelight he began. Field Manual for Common Works, Volume 1. Foundations, Trusses, and the Law of Even Bearing. He scratched sentences broad as beams, cursing blots, but the words took shape. Autumn blew chill from the west, carrying ironborn war cries cut short by Tarth ballista bolts. The joint fleet harried raiders gutted of surprise, drove them back beyond Pike. But another storm gathered inland, where no galley could sail. A fever came first to Cobbler's Row in King's Landing. Children shivering. Skin mottled blue-gray. "Rat fever," the maesters whispered. Yet different, lungs filled not with water but with a tarry soot. Soon scores lay gasping even in open courtyards. The Circle's healers traced the outbreak to Blackstone quarries near Nuns Deep, where frugal kiln masters had burned low-grade coal laced with sulfur. Poison-laced smoke had drifted downwind, settling on laundry, rooftops, wells. A purely man-made plague, birthed from cheap fire. The Circle dispatched pleas to every region for charcoal, lime filters, fresh air pumps. Sandor received Brienne's raven at Lonely Light Beacon while fitting a beacon lens. He felt the parchment's tremor between thumb and forefinger. A crisis of flame again, only hidden in air. The Ash King's vow allowed no rest. He rode inland as leaves turned copper. Arya came too, but veered north to fetch clean peat from bog harvesters. Sandor pressed straight for Nuns Deep. There he found open pits, belching yellow smoke. Miners hacking veins to fill furnaces that stoked a massive brick kiln ring. Overseers claimed the bricks lined half the realm's hearths. Shutting the fires would stall winter warmth. Yet he saw children coughing crimson threads at the gate. He strode into the largest kiln shed and kicked the stoke door closed. Sparks whirled round his legs. Overseers shouted. He seized a pry bar, jammed the coal chute, and roared until his voice scraped. "Shut it or I bury it." One overseer reached for a whip. Sandor backhanded him across a table, then dragged the man outside and forced him to kneel beside a dying girl, so her rattling breath filled his ears. When the overseer wept, Sandor released him and turned to the miners. "For each kiln you close," he said, "I'll show 3 ways to fire brick smokeless. For each day you run this poison, I'll tear a chimney down with my own hands." Fear and respect mixed behind the miners' soot-rimmed eyes. They banked the fires by dusk. Sandor dug air shafts, taught them to stack alternating vent flues, mix salt glazing to seal creosote inside the clay, rather than foul the wind. Within a fortnight, kilns reopened under new patterns. Smoke lifted pale gray. no choking sulfur hiss. The plague receded. Yet the effort cost him. Each climb in chimney guts sliced lung tissue thin as paper. Each cough afterward bled a thread of red that he spat in secret. Sleepless nights drafting vent baffle diagrams with a half-shaken hand left him hollow. When Arya returned, bog peat wagons in tow, she found him by the cistern, shoulders hunched, fever bright in his good eye. "You'll drink willow ash broth," she ordered, voice iron. "And rest." Walls still sag. He gestured at clay-drying sheds propped with makeshift buttresses. "They can sag 2 days more." She built a lean-to near the well, stoked a peat brazier for steady warmth. Nymeria lay across the entrance like a living gate. Sandor drifted in and out of restless sleep, haunted by green fire chasing him through smokestacks that narrowed until he crawled on elbows. Each time he jerked awake, Arya was there, wiping clammy brow with cold cloth. She read passages from the field manual draft, correcting his half-legible scrawl, teasing that he spelled cantilever like "can't leave her." He grumbled, but a faint grin tugged at scar tissue. 2 weeks of broth and forced idleness healed the fever, though the cough lingered as gravel rasped. He returned to work slower, letting younger masons haul bricks while he checked plumb lines. Age at last sank talons, however gently. 6 winters slipped by. The fisher fleet kept Ironborn at bay. Kiln smoke in the Crownlands flowed blue and clean. Sandor's manuals multiplied, copied by guild novices into calf-hide folios. Volume 2, Bracing River Levees. 3 fire breaks and chimney draft. 4 stone bridges and the geometry of arches. No lord mandated their use, yet by the 8th year farmers from the Reach quoted his rule of thumb. Stack wood cross grain, so light may pass as wind does, as gospel. Still, peace proved a restive sleeper. On the eve of the 8th spring, a violent tremor shook the Dornish marches, cracking limestone ridges and damming the Greenblood's upper fork. Water, that once seeped slow, now roared seaward, swelling tributaries that fed the Blackwater. Floods rushed north, devouring levees. Snapping ferry chains. In King's Landing the Circle's watch measured the river crest rising thumb-widths by the hour. They stared at stone embankments rebuilt after the wildfire war and prayed mortars still held. Brienne sent riders. Sandor, encamped near Rosby teaching apprentices to mix limecrete, answered at once though his joints ached in the damp. He charged them to finish the training without him. "You've got the rules. Mortar your courage," and rode through sheets of wind-driven rain toward the capital's swollen river. He arrived at dawn amid chaos. Barge piers bucked under root-tangled debris. Tides battered the new grain silos. On the eastern quarter wall, cracks spidered where the foundation met river mud. A single breach here, and half the Fogward district would drown. Sandor dismounted into knee-deep churn and barked for every able mason, potter, and fishmonger with strong arms. They formed bucket lines, shoring the weakest span with sacks of dredged gravel. He climbed scaffolds laced with rain-slick rope, drove oak pilings by sledge while the wall shook under each surge. The cough tore at him, yet he ignored pain. He felt again that barrel of wildfire from decades earlier. Choice narrowed to lift or perish, no second chance. When night fell, the water crested a final measure, lapped against the burlap bulwark, and stopped. Tide turned. The city exhaled. Citizens lit candles along the quay in silent thanksgiving. A hush swept like wind through wheat, falling finally on Sandor where he stood atop the scaffold, shoulders sagging. Brienne climbed to clasp his arm. "Rest. The wall holds. It holds for now." He peered at mortar lines throbbing with seep. Needs relaying when waters drop. Stone soaked soft as stone begging to crack come frost. "Tomorrow," she insisted. He started to nod, and the world tilted. Breath lodged behind his breastbone, molten and sharp. Knees buckled. Only Brienne's grip slowed the fall. She shouted, but her voice blurred against roaring in his ears. He tasted copper, old friend, and glimpsed distant torch flames shimmering like ghostly wildfire suddenly safe behind glass. They ferried him to the Sept infirmary where the circle's chief healer pressed linen steeped in icebane root to his chest. Arya arrived by midnight, boots dripping, face blank save the tremor at her mouth's corner. Davos, leaning on a cane, whispered prayers to a god of his own crafting. Brienne stood sentinel while healers dredged brown fluid from cracked lungs. Near dawn, Sandor's eyes opened, irises less fierce ember now than cool granite. Arya leaned close. "You stubborn hound," he rasped. "Wall? Dry." "She'll stand." His lips twisted. "Good. I'm tired of walls." A pause, breath rattling. Hammers heavy. She set his closest manual, Volume 1, on the cot by his arm. "Leave the hammer. Words weigh less." He lifted calloused fingers, traced the cover where her neat script had replaced his clumsy scrawl. A small nod. "Keep building," he murmured. Voice air on steel. "Fire comes. You stop it." His gaze flicked to Brienne, then Davos. "Circle matters. Don't fight over chairs." "We won't," Brienne said, voice breaking like wave on rock. He managed one last breath, a sound not quite a laugh. "Teach the wolves to carry water buckets." The breath slipped out long and quiet. Shoulders settled. A final cough never came. Outside the sept, bells tolled, not in mourning alone but remembrance. No crown lay upon his brow. No herald recited lineage. Yet cities and hamlets alike doused hearth fires that night, letting embers rest dark in tribes of ash. So the sky above the realm glowed untroubled by smoke, a canopy of stars for the man who had beaten back the flame in life and deserved clean night and death. They buried him on the hill of Rhaenys, north face, where morning sun first touched the slab of names from the muddy field volunteers. Stonemasons set no ornate effigy, only a waist-high block of river granite quarried near Nuns Deep, inscription carved in letters plain and deep. "Here lies Sandor Clegane, Grey Hand of the realm." He stood between fire and flesh. Nymeria nosed the fresh earth, then lifted her head and howled a low, lingering note that rolled across rooftops to the shipmasts, to the Merchant's Walk, to the Circle Rotunda, where crowds waited candles in hand. Brienne, now confirmed as Marshal Regent for a 1-year term, stepped to the front. In her palm she held Sandor's war-scarred hammer. She raised it, haft vertical, iron head catching dawn. "This," she called, "is not a weapon alone. It is a tool, a builder's mark. Let every guild and every lord remember. What you shape with your hands outlives what you destroy." She drove the hammer into the soil beside the stone where it stood upright, half buried, a handle any passer-by might grip if storms ever threatened again. Years unspooled, quiet but restless. The circle expanded from 12 to 24, 2 seats for every province. They legislated the hammer oath. Cooper, smith, or sailor, each apprentice must know the field manual's first chapter before claiming journeyman's wage. Brickyards from the neck to Dorne stamped a crossed hammer's sigil on every kiln-fired brick in honor of Grey Hand. Even children recited the builder's rhyme, a sing-song litany Arya penned. "Stack it straight, mortar true, stone on stone and water through. Wind may shake and fire may bite, but walls stand firm where hands unite." Arya herself ranged farther after the burial, charting unknown seas beyond the sunset. Yet each voyage returned with hull, holds full of cedar saplings for replanting along coasts. Stripped by iron-born raids, she swore reavers feared saplings more than swords now, for forests promised shipyards free from plunderers' tolls. Brienne aged into gray-haired stalwart, guiding young marshals who quoted Sandor so often that the phrase, "Hound's counsel," entered court slang for blunt wisdom. Davos spent final seasons teaching circle scribes to keep ledgers honest as salt, then died peacefully in a chair, quill in hand, mouth shaping thanks to a king who was never king. And somewhere far north, rumor persisted of a lone direwolf, with silver coat and eyes like sunrise on snow. Farmers swore she trotted ridge lines at planting time as though inspecting furrows. At night, if torch flames flickered too high, she'd appear, standing still until hands remembered to bank the fire. Legend had it a giant walked behind her shadow, unseen but felt, ready to bark once more if the world ever forgot how to keep its blaze in check. Thus the realm endured, not free from trouble, never unscarred, yet learning, brick by brick, line by line, how to wield fire as servant, not master. And in every corner where sparks flew from forge or hearth, some voice, young or hoarse with years, would mutter the maxim scratched long ago by a scarred hand beneath wavering lamplight. Build so flame must ask permission to pass. Even the restless flames learned, at last, to whisper their respect. Jane ein die. All. The summer that followed Sandor Clegane's silent passing broke over Westeros in a hush, as though the very sky had bowed its bright head in respect before raising it again, determined to prove that the turning of seasons could still outpace human grief. Wheat grew higher along the crownlands terraces than any farmer remembered. Juniper and apple burst into blossom in the Kingswood with a riot of fragrance that drifted all the way to the city gates. It seemed the earth itself embraced a mandate whispered over his grave. Grow, mend, refuse to spare. Yet beneath the budding branches ran newer roots, fresh and shallow, that had to learn how to hold fast in their own right, without the great burnt iron hand that once tamped soil around them. Brienne of Tarth walked the ramparts at dawn most days, the ache of age in her knees counting step for step, with the ache of loss. She had known grief before, Renly's silken smile cut by shadow, Podrick's earnest gaze blinking shut on a battlefield in the Vale, Jaime's bitter laughter fading into silence somewhere under the sea. But this was different. Those deaths were blades driven inward, sharp and private. Sandor's departure felt like a stone removed from the foundation of a keep. The structure above still stood, but she sensed the hollowness where weight and warmth once pressed. So each morning she tested the stones, not with hammer or pry bar, but with plain sight and practiced ear, listening for the telltale whisper of weakness. She found little. The city's walls hummed steadily, as if the granite itself remembered the touch of the man who had braced it against flood and flame, and meant to honor his memory by lasting 1,000 years more. The circle gathered twice that summer in the rotunda beneath stained glass panes. Sunlight spilled across the table, crawling from one representative to the next as hours passed. Lessa Tide, fisherwoman of Driftmark, kept her seat, though a winter cough clung stubborn as barnacles. Garin Clay, the farrier from Duskendale, newly elevated to fill Davos' empty place, spoke rarely but always concisely, a habit Sandor would have approved. Debate circled around granary quotas, orphan bursaries, the forever gnarled question of how broad a levy one could lay upon the Golden Company's mercantile cousins, now that legitimate trade with Volantis was reopened. And through every subject wove a single thread. What next? What, when another wall cracked? Or a new fire kindled? None asked it aloud, yet each heard unspoken echo. Who takes the hammer? They might have turned to Brienne, whose name carried its own iron ring, but she tore that idea from the ledger before it sprouted. She would not be a queen, steward, or crowned mason. Her shoulders already bore the title of martial regent, and she would not let them stoop under the unnatural posture of a monarch's throne. Instead, she proposed a traveling company of builders, a Greyhand corps recruited from every province, trained at the new Guildhall in King's Landing, then dispatched wherever stone groaned or levies threatened. 2 apprentices from each guild, rotated seasonal so-craft knowledge, flowed back into villages. The circle seized on the plan like drowning swimmers catching rope. Within a month, messengers rode to announce selection trials, not of noble birth or purse, but of sinew, patience, eye for straight lines, and a willingness to sleep under beams not yet braced. The very first drafting fair convened beneath Sandor's old scaffold near the mud gate. Tents sprouted along the quay, blacksmiths' awnings red with heat haze, carpenters' stalls perfumed with fresh sawn cedar, potters spinning quick demonstrations of kiln stacking. Young men and women queued from dawn, each gripping some token of their trade. A joiner's mallet worn smooth, a chipped adze, a leather apron stiff with mortar dust. Among them stood a boy of perhaps 14 summers, slight as a willow switch and freckled, whose only offering was a dog-eared copy of Volume 1. The overseers eyed him askance until he flipped to a page annotated in neat, careful script, describing a culvert fix that had saved his hamlet in the previous spring's rain swell. He was accepted on the spot, the first of many living proofs that a manual, like a seed, germinated best in prepared soil. For Arya Stark, the season brought restlessness that neither ship's deck nor saddle leather could soothe. She had sailed farther than even the summer isles, glimpsed ivory beaches where giant tortoises nested, charted shoals aglitter with fish like living opals. Yet every horizon now reminded her of a different map, the blueprint of levees and bridges, water wheels and hearth chimneys scrawled in Sandor's broad letters, margin noted by her own narrower hand. She returned to King's Landing unannounced one blue-white morning, slipping through the north gate with Nymeria padding loose-eared at her flank. A legendary wraith few guards could decide whether to salute or flee. She found the Guildhall already humming with recruits, and took to prowling its galleries at night, fingering plumb bobs, whispering quiet corrections into open folios. In the scriptorium, she discovered the copyists had reached Volume 5, a work left unfinished at Sandor's death, skeleton chapters on tidal mills and arch-hinged sluice gates. Dozens of blank pages gaped like pulled teeth at the back half. Without ceremony she claimed a desk, brewed bitter leaf tea to keep herself awake, and began writing. Her first line stuttered, for though she had captured his spoken lessons often, conjuring new instruction felt sacrilegious. But memory rose to guide her, his voice lecturing over the crash of surf near Driftmark, the rasp of his laugh when she likened counterweights to careless lords, always asking if she understood why before nodding approval. She wrote those whys now, coaxing principles from recollection and stubborn follow-through. By the third night, candlelight found her hunched yet steady, letter forms crisp, diagrams measured with a battered compass Jaime Lannister had once gifted her in some half-forgotten peace overture. Other scribes joined, young and eager, each tasked with layering vellum overlays, exploded sketches of pin-gear flows, stress arcs over mill races, until the manual swelled thicker than its predecessors. She retitled it Volume 5, Water's Strength, Sandor's Whisper. The Circle approved its adoption unanimously, and ordered it copied into 300 pocket folios sealed in oilskin for every Greyhand Corps unit. Somewhere, Arya thought, the ghost of a burnt giant might grunt amusement at having his voice travel in so many satchels. While parchment soaked up ink, the world outside brewed storms no manual could preempt. In the upper neck, a splinter group of ex-mercenaries calling themselves the Thenic Cartographers began selling maps that allegedly marked deposits of dragonglass and mythic hellstone, the last rumored cousin to wildfire, molten and self-kindling. Their caravans winked in and out of woodline like foxfire, leaving behind only holes gouged in hillsides and fumes that sickened livestock. When word reached the Circle, Brienne sent envoys requesting a halt and proof of claims. The cartographers answered with a wagon of raw ore that shattered 3 pickaxes and leaked fumes hot enough to blister skin. Panic rippled through smallfolk once rumors jumped that hellstone could melt city walls in a night. With the Circle snarled in debate, trade rights versus outright ban, Brienne turned to Arya, still ink-stained, and asked for eyes on the ground. Arya left within the hour, Nymeria loping ahead. She took with her a squad of Greyhand apprentices, nominally to test bridge designs across the Fever River, but in truth to keep them close should unsavory mining pits need sudden shoring or sealing. Among that squad strode the freckled boy, eager to measure real arches against the figures he'd cherished in Volume 1. He introduced himself as Tommen Two Lines, for his habit of always drawing guides twice to check the match. Their journey north threaded along shepherd's trails grown lush with summer grays. They bivouacked under willows, practicing rope sling knots that Sandor had insisted could hoist beam or wounded friend with equal ease. On the 12th day, they saw their first cartographer dig. A gash in the earth ringed by winch poles, rope ladders vanishing into acrid fog. Iron cages hung ready for ore, yet no workers sang mine psalms. Instead, weary figures coughed behind damp cloths tied around faces. Arya crouched among dogwoods on the ridge, studied a boulder that glowed faintly green where pick strikes had chipped it. Even from 50 paces, the stone radiated an oily heat. She signaled retreat. That night by low fire she questioned a captured night watchman, barely older than Tommen, who described foremen with cracked lips speaking of buyers across the narrow sea, willing to pay dragon's weight in gold for hellstone, no matter its risks. When Arya asked if the buyers meant to weaponize the ore, the boy spat blood-flecked phlegm and shrugged. A storm cares not why a tree falls, m'lady, only that wind blows. He died before dawn, lungs burned raw. Arya traced the merchant route south and found evidence of at least 3 caravans having slipped past customs posts at White Harbor. She diverted a pair of scouts, quiet girls from the Vale, to warn the harbor master while the rest followed the cartographer main camp, perched at the edge of Hag's Mire. The camp pulsed with shadowy lamplight and hammer clang that struck sparks into night air like tiny malevolent stars. They saw stockpiles of ore under damp sailcloth, stacked for barge loading. A direct assault risked setting the ore ablaze. So Arya hatched a subtler plan. Reroute the Mire's sluggish tributary through hastily cut channels, flood the pit, and drown the fires before hellstone could reach smelters. The apprentices balked at reshaping landscape overnight until Tommen 2 lines pointed to a contour in their survey sketches where old beaver dams once stood. "Drop those," he said shyly. "Water'll course itself with only a nudge." Arya's grin in torch glow reminded him of myths where wolves teach foxes new tricks. They worked beneath clouded stars, axes knocking dam braces free while others widened breaches. At dawn's weak first light, the river surged, mud-heavy and relentless, rushing like unleashed memory through cutbanks. It hit the mine with a roar, steam rising as cursed ore hissed. Workers scrambled, foremen shouted, wagons bogged and tilted, spilling soaked hellstone that fizzled on wet loam. No cataclysm burst forth. Instead, the soggy ore cooled into brittle clumps, inert enough to break under boot. Arya watched from a knoll. When she was certain the flood had quenched every glow, she turned and led her troop away, leaving the cartographers to explain their ruin to ghost buyers who would never come. But such victories seldom remain neat. Weeks later, at a session of the Circle, 3 Eastern merchants bearing Qartheen charters lodged formal complaint. Vandals had destroyed lawful holdings and cost investors fortunes. They demanded restitution, or failing that, loosening of Crown lands tariffs as compensation. The fisherwoman Lessa Tide snorted so hard she nearly swallowed a salmon-bone toothpick. Garin Clay fingered the pommel of his belt knife. Deadlock loomed until Arya entered, cloak still damp from northern rain, and laid a fist-sized lump of blighted hellstone on the mosaic floor. It emitted a faint heat even now. The nearest envoy recoiled. "Touch your lawful fortune," she invited. None accepted. She told them of the dead watchman, the blistered foreman, the smoke faintly sweet like roasting pig that carried plague for miles. Then she opened Sandor's Volume 5 and read a line she had inked herself but felt him speak. "Any fire that cares not whence it burns must be answered with earth, stone, and water united." The Circle voted to outlaw hellstone trade. Brienne authorized the Greyhand Corps to seal any vent bearing its glow. Foreign merchants grumbled but ceded. No gold weighed heavier than fear. That autumn, the Corps saw their first full graduation. Rows of broad-shouldered, scar-fingered youths stood on the plaza, each bearing a hammer carved with crossed wolf and hound sigils. Brienne addressed them briefly. Sandor's distaste for speeches still guided her tongue, reminding them roofs sag, rivers flood, greedy men dig holes, and their task was to fill voids before they swallowed hope. Then she stepped aside for Arya, who held Volume 1 aloft. Inside these pages, she said, are rules proven by sweat and burn scars. But rules alone are timber stacked. You must strike flint to spark them into shelter. Go. Hammers thumped chests in salute, a thunder that rolled up the hill of Rainey's and down again, touching the stone where Sander lay. Some swear the hammer planted beside his marker trembled in answer, though wind was calm. Yet the realm's testing was far from done. 2 winters hence, a comet, fat, red, trailing a tail like blazing rope, burned across the night sky. Farmers hailed it as good omen, but maesters muttered of axial shift and tides unsettled. In the Trident Delta, water reversed one night, dragging fishing skiffs inland, smashing them against mangrove trunks. In Old Town, the Hightower astrologers recorded stars drifting off course by fractions frightening to those who mapped seasons by constellations. Loose talk spread. Perhaps dragons stirred beneath molten stone. Perhaps the comet's fiery drool was omen of a second-long night. The circle convened an extraordinary midnight council. Candles spat wax. Storm winds rattled shutters. Lessetide argued for marshalling fleets stocked with grain. For if tides changed patterns, coastlines might starve. Garin Clay proposed reinforcing every bridge over major rivers, anticipating freshets. Others spoke of prayer rituals, a comfort Brienne tolerated, but did not share. Consultation letters flew to Citadel. Replies returned thick with contradictory theories. When tension neared breaking, the freckled apprentice, Toman 2 lines, now a certified journeyman, stood from the shadows at the back. He carried a bundle of crayon chalk sketches on oiled linen. Observations on tidal lag across the narrow sea, his cover read awkwardly. He laid drawings atop the council table. Graphs of water rise recorded at every Greyhound beacon along the coast, the week the comet appeared. Lines showed a wave pattern like a voice drawn on parchment. A single resonance traveling, suggesting a seaquake far beyond the Sunset Islands, too distant for conventional warning. Such a wave could circle the globe in crescents, upsetting rivers and harbors months after the trigger. Arya, standing with arms folded, nodded slowly. Brienne asked what mitigation he proposed. Toman cleared his throat. We cannot stop the wave once set, but we can brace harbors, open sluice gates, dredge river mouths so surge vents inland instead of smashing harbor walls. We build conduits. Conduits. The word rippled through the chamber. Even skeptical elders leaned forward. Volume 5 discussed sluices, but on small scale. Expanding that to entire coastlines demanded unprecedented coordination. Yet they had a core now maps, and a creed etched in stone. The circle looked to Brienne, who inhaled and exhaled as if drawing Sandor's own hard-earned certainty. We do it, she said. We start tonight. Sundown tomorrow, riders leave to every beacon. She tapped Volume 5. Addendum Project, the 1,000-arched tidebreaker. I want Toman to oversee drafts under Lady Arya's supervision. Nam? And so began the greatest work since rebuilding King's Landing. 30,000 laborers, 400 Greyhound teams, 3 full harvest seasons redirected. They cut spill channels through peninsulas, erecting hinge weirs that stayed open unless surge forced them closed. They dredged silt bars where trident brews met tide, lining the banks with willow root mats. They carved wide-throated groins from driftstone at Gulltown, angled so water would turn seaward rather than batter breakwaters. At every site the central tenet repeated, build so flame must ask permission to pass, modified, build so water must bow before it dwells. Skeptics scoffed. Such ambition had toppled empires. Yet community thrived on shared mission. Villagers volunteered to weave willow mats. Septas handed out broth to ditch diggers. Even highborn ladies stitched tarpaulin sleeves for cofferdam pumps. The Greyhounds did not dictate. They taught. On the 16th month, when Comet's tail at last faded and sea looked normal, a deep tremor shook just past the Sunset Islands. Maesters felt it through quills as ink rippled in inkwells. The wave Toman predicted formed, invisible at first. Days later, It reached the Stormland's coast as a wall of glass-green water, 30 feet tall. At Storm's End, newly opened sluice gates swallowed half the force, directing torrent into underground caverns once sealed since ancient days. At the Blackwater, river-mouth conduits siphoned surge away from quay before it breached. Gultown's angled groin split crest into two curling tongues that spent fury on bare cliffs. Losses occurred, warehouses flattened, fishing nets shredded, but cities endured. From Eastwatch to Arbor, bells tolled gratitude, not mourning. When reports confirmed success, the Circle convened a dawn assembly on the hill of Rainey's. Workers muddy to the hips stood among stewards in velvet. All had earned place. Brienne, hair swept back by salt wind, addressed them. She spoke of how stone and water, once foes, had learned new dance. She named Toman, 2 lines master of conduits, youngest ever to hold such title. And she laid upon the granite block beside Sandor's hammer a fresh tool. A drafting compass wrought in silver and jade, its arms locked at the perfect arch angle. It gleamed beside the old weather-dark hammer, the mind aligning with muscle, a union of intention and force. Arya watched, arms folded, a rare moisture brightening her eyes. She thought of Sandor's first crude compass, the one Jaime had given her. She pictured his missing laughter, seeing its echo forged in precious metal. She almost heard him grunt, "Fancy, but it'll draw circles same as any twig in the dirt." She smiled. Night fell after the ceremony, but the hill of Rainey stayed bright under lanterns. People lingered, some telling stories of the wave, others humming tavern ballads about the Dog King's ghost, rattling screw piles beneath harbors to help the core. Children chased one another around the stone, tapping the hammers half for luck. At a quiet moment, Arya knelt and placed her palm on the granite, head bowed. Nymeria lay beside her, nose to the ground. "Still building," she whispered. "Still." Dandel. She felt nothing supernatural, no tremor, no spectral warmth. Only cool stone sturdy beneath flesh. Yet that was answer enough. The work stood. That was his voice now. Silent, yet everywhere. She rose, brushed grit from her knee, and turned toward the gate where Brienne waited leaning on the rail. Together they walked down the slope. Behind them, lantern light painted 2 shadows across the grass. One tall and broad-shouldered, one lithe and quick, melding into single silhouette before fading in the dark. Ka. Morning mists drifted across the Blackwater like pale ghosts, veiling the newly completed tide sluice towers in shreds of silver vapor. They rose at uneven intervals along the opposite bank, 8 granite pillars rooted in riverbed bedrock, their lower arches gaping like the mouths of sleeping behemoths. A stranger might have taken them for monuments to forgotten kings. Only when water surged whistling through their vent throats would the truth emerge, for each tower was a lung in the 1,000-arch tidebreaker, drawing torrents into hidden vaults where they lost their fury against labyrinth walls. Tommen 2 lines stood on the grand walk scaffolding between towers 3 and 4, running calloused fingers over a seam where fresh mortar met green-tinged igneous stone. Night's chill had not yet bled from the mortar. Frost fringed the northward edge, promising hairline splits if the lime mixture lacked its full cure. He tapped gently with his iron gauge rod, listening for hollowness. The note rang steady, but his brow furrowed anyway. Perfection could never be assumed. Sandor's first rule still whispered from every page in his mind. Check the line thrice, for the 3rd time tests the heart, not the hand. While he worked, a lone skiff nosed upriver through swirling fog, its oar strokes slow and deliberate. Tommen paused to watch. Few dared the river so close to dawn. He saw a cloaked figure at the prow, lean build, hair bound in a tail. Even without the direwolf shadow gliding along the deck, he would have known her. Tommen raised a hand. Arya Stark returned the gesture, steering for the ladder rig. She climbed up fluidly despite travel grime, Nymeria waiting below to guard the skiff. Her eyes tracked Tommen's assessment of the stone before she spoke. Surface check or suspicion? Suspicion, he admitted. This seems cure time seemed suspiciously fast. Rapid set may hide weak mixing. Her half-smile was approving. Best discover that before the next surge does. She produced a leather tube from her satchel. And here's the next surge. Inside lay a scribe's map traced on pale calfskin, dotted with keyed numbers. Astrologers in Old Town recorded a cluster of submarine quakes west-southwest of the arbor. Within 10 days we might see a reflected tide pulse, smaller than the last, but earlier than predicted. Toman absorbed the figures, tracing the quake pings. Southward wave funneling through the stepstones could strike Storm's End first, ricochet, then ride the Blackwater Channel, he murmured. We'll need to close Tower 6's shutters one tide ahead and open 2 auxiliary spill trenches on the south bank. And warn the Massey Hook villages, Arya added. I'll ride out today. The Corps at Sea-Watch will be ready. Her gaze lingered on the mortar seam, seeing it as he did. I can send a stone crew this afternoon. No, I'll cut it out and repack new mix myself, Tommen said. If it fails, I want my hands blamed. A Hound's answer. She clasped his shoulder. Good. Keep barking. He watched her descend to the skiff, direwolf flowing behind. When the boat slipped back into fog, he set about chiseling the seam loose, old mallet thumping in the hush. Sunlight crept above the city spires and glinted off chisel edge, each spark a memory of the hammer planted on the hill of Rainey's. Beyond the narrow sea, where the Rhoyne spread into 1,000 clotted marshes, another spark kindled. A coterie of Sarnori shipwrights, once allies of the disgraced Thenic cartographers, had not forgotten Arya Stark's flood that ruined their profitable Hellstone dig. For months, they had scoured seaborne markets, salvaging fragments of ruined ore, each no larger than a man's fist, and isolating the volatile shale that, when ground fine, burned emerald at a match. They lacked pyromancers. Instead, they courted alchemists from Lys with promises of queenly rewards for a formula that would bind Hellstone dust in a compound stable at rest, but frenzied when wetted with salt water. Their first cask exploded at the touch of humid air, incinerating a warehouse and half the conspirators. The survivors named that failure lesson, not defeat. By the time autumn gales bent the wine country olives toward Myr, the shipwrights had filled 5 slender barrels, cedar staves wrapped in tin rings, lined with oil-soaked silk. Each weighed only 80 pounds, yet packed the ravenous appetite of wildfire, squared. They christened their creation Hiskari Breath, for it reeked faintly of old blood. Their plan: run the Stepstones blockade at night, beach on the Blackwater's north mudflats, breach 2 tidebreaker towers with charges, and let the river swallow King's Landing whole. Chaos would drown the circle and reopen Westeros to old hierarchies that prized coin over common rule. For speed they chose 3 Myrish skimmers rigged fore and aft like seagulls, each crewed by 10 men desperate or damned. Rumors of the attempt reached Westeros as a barmaid's tall tale in Gulltown, where a drunk pirate bragged of green death in barrels heading for the Dog King's city. The story hopped taverns until a Greyhand quartermaster overheard and flagged it to Marshal Brienne. Within hours ravens fanned out. Within 2 days Arya had copies of the report. She returned to the rotunda, cloak ragged from salt spray, demanding a fast sloop and 30 volunteer archers. Brienne raised iron-flecked brows, but said only, "Fetch what you need." Arya named Tommen as her second. He protested that Tower 6 required completion, yet she insisted, "If towers fall, no seam will matter." 6 days later, their sloop, Tyrius Promise, slipped from the Dunford Inlet under a ghost moon. Each archer carried whistling arrows with salt-waxed heads. Quivers lined the rail. Tommen crouched by the mast, studying scroll charts of currents, marking likely approach vectors for enemy craft. Arya scanned the horizon, wolf eyes narrowed. Fog clung low on the water, stifling starlight. Just before dawn, the lookout murmured, "Sails." 3 dim shapes ghosted windward, oars muffled. Arya raised a hand. No shout, silent preparation. The sloop pivoted, running parallel. She signaled 2 archers to the foredeck blister, Tommen to ready grappling lines. When first skimmer drew within stone throw, Arya's arrow arced high, its shriek slicing night. It thudded into enemy sail, flickering silver fire along waxed cloth. A second arrow punched the stern rope coil, igniting tar sheened onto deckboards. The Mirish crew answered with guttural curses, rowing faster, but flame leapt rigging in greedy threads. A scream pierced fog as canvas collapsed ablaze. Barrels stored midship began to hiss. Arya's voice cracked, "Down!" The sloop veered, oars backing water. A roar split dawn. Green light spat 20 yards tall, water turning to steam. Heat washed over Tyrrhius' promise as first skimmer disintegrated in luminous shards, its Giscari breath devouring hull and men alike. Yet the other two vessels had already angled apart. Gambling that one bomb spent meant less vigilance. They cut north, aiming for the reed-choked mouth where Tidebreaker Tower 2 rose half a league beyond. Arya loosed pursuit. Tommen threw wheeled buckets of river clay onto the sloop's deck to smother stray embers. Arrows hissed past. One buried itself in his shoulder. He bit back cry, snapped the shaft. Fog thinned. Towers loomed ahead, moonlit fangs. Crewmen on surviving skimmers labored to heave slat boxes overboard, floats rigged to drift with tide and detonate on impact. Arya saw faint slicks of oil where boxes skimmed surface. "We cannot let even one reach the sluice," Tommen gasped. Blood darkened his shirt, but he gripped the rail. "Shoot the floats." Arrows flew, but many missed in choppy swell. Arya swore, tossed bow aside, and vaulted onto the sloop's skiff tether. "Take helm. Hold course." She kicked the skiff loose, paddling triangle strokes. Nymeria circled deck, snarling. Dawn blush crept along horizon. Tommen steadied the tiller. Pain throbbed. He forced breath, scanned the floats. 5, maybe 6, bobbing like innocuous casks. He recalled Sandor's dictum: "Know the path before you swing." Muscles burned, but he clutched a coil of grappling line. In his head, he drafted parabolic arcs, factoring wind. He stripped slack, spun, and cast. Hook bit the nearest float, dragging it toward the sloop. "Buckets," he cried. 2 deckhands fetched river clay. Together they wrestled the float onto a canvas tarp, packed clay over seam cracks. A faint sizzling leaked, but muffled. They heaved it over again on downstream side, letting current carry inert mass away. Meanwhile, Arya's skiff wove among floats, cutting lines with her long knife, then tilting the wood crates. Water poured through slats, dampening inner silk. Twice green vapor puffed, twice she ducked. A Mirish crossbow bolt whined past. She sprang across open water, landed on second skimmer's gunwale, carved through a deckhand's thigh, and kicked a lantern into stored barrels. She sprang clear as vessel blossomed firelight. A third blast thundered across river, this one smaller, contained by Arya's dousing. Plumes geysered Arya of golden steam. The final skimmer, crippled but afloat, angled for reed flats. Tommen's arrow, shot left-handed, skewered its tiller rope. Momentum swung broadside into Tower 2's stone base with a crunch. Barrels rolled free, yet waterlogged. Crew scrambled up chain netting, hugging tower face. Garrison soldiers shouted from parapet, but too late. 2 saboteurs reached an intake shutter, pried pins. Tommen's world tunneled, tower seam, mortar, weakness. He saw stones fracture under explosion, dream vision of valley floods. He braced helm, shouted to beach the sloop at Tower's Fisher Pier. Pain blurred. He ran along rocking pier planks, shoulder wet with blood. Saboteurs grappled shutter ring. One swung a hatchet, sparks flew. Tommen hurled himself upward, catching their rope. Thump of impact jostled the first man off balance. Hatchet fell. The second lunged with dirk. Tommen ducked. Seized attacker's wrist, jammed wounded shoulder forward. White flashes knifed his vision. He locked their arms against shutter hinge and shouted to guards above. A spear point thrust downward, skewering the saboteur's calf. Man wailed. First raider regained footing, clutching steel match to ignite barrel fuse. Tommen headbutted his chest. They slammed against intake bars. A pop, match struck. Tiny ember flared. Tommen clamped the match with bare hand, searing flesh, but quenching spark. He roared through teeth, wrenched the man's belt, and pitched him into river. Soldiers hauled Toman up. Blood and grime streaked his face. Up on parapet he leaned against crenellation, watching last float bomb sink harmlessly, where Nymeria, soaked, paddled circles, Arya clinging to her mane. When wolf and woman reached the pier, Toman allowed consciousness to slip sideways into darkness, satisfied no tower fell. He woke 3 days later in the Circle infirmary, shoulder bound, palm blistered raw. Brienne sat beside the cot, gauntlets off, hands leisurely darning a torn sleeve. When he stirred, she looked up. 2 saboteurs captured, she said. They knew nothing beyond coin. Their ships carried sealed letters from Sarnori backers, promising 500 crowns for collapse of tide towers. We found fragments of hellstone inside charred barrels. Less than a bucketful survived your dousing. No city burned. Toman exhaled. Arya? Bruised, stitched, hungry, already mapping reed flats for patrol posts. Brienne studied his wrapped palm. Foolish to smother a match with flesh. Stone chooses no safe moment, he answered. She nodded, knowing. Later Arya arrived, throat rasped from river smoke, hair still smelling of tar. She tossed a small bundle onto his cot, the broken matchstick, encased now in clear resin. Maesters say relics can teach. Put it on your desk. He eyed the resin. A reminder of stupidity, of choosing pain so others breathe. She perched on stool. Volume 7 will open with a section on float explosives and countermeasures. I need diagrams of vent shutters. Show how to anchor chain nets to prevent grapple access. He smiled weakly. Dictate. I'll sketch. They worked through afternoon, ink blotting gauze as he gripped quill left-handed. Outside, bells tolled midday. People bustled along Guild Market, unaware how close dawn had skated to oblivion again. But eventually word spread. Of a boy builder who caught fire with bear palm. Of a she-wolf who rode steam to cut sails. Of ghastly green blasts quenched by tower stones. Street singers soon paired their deeds with those of the Dog King, weaving continuity only myth can grant. Winter proper, crested on a wind, freighted with star crystal and brittle promises. Snow dusted the hill of Rainey's, edging Sanders' hammer in white lace. Brienne, Arya, and Toman climbed to pay respects on the night solstice, bearing no torches, only moonlight guided by stands of glow moss that Greyhand Corps botanists had coaxed into gentle luminescence for festival. Where once only cold stone greeted them, now a narrow pergola arched above the grave, entwined with winter jasmine whose blossoms release scent even under frost. Corps carpenters carved it from leftover tidebreaker oak, each beam etched with names of builders lost in service that year. On the crossbeam a simple brass plate read, "The work continues." They knelt. Brienne spoke first, voice softened by age and wind. "Your hammers multiply, Sandor. Hope you do not mind the noise." Arya smiled, imagining him growling about racket, but smiling inside. Toman placed the resin match on a ledge beside the silver compass, a triangle of memory. Hammer, compass, flame arrested. As they stood to leave, a hush settled deep enough to hear snowflakes kiss oak beam. Somewhere down in the city, a bell rang, but muted. A bell of change, not alarm. Toman looked back once and saw moonlight gleam along the hammer haft, so that it seemed freshly oiled, ready for another hand. He could almost believe a huge shadow rose behind the pergola, giving silent nod. They descended the hill into the sleeping city. Over rooftops, the towers of the tidebreaker stood black against sky, but he heard river water rushing steady through labyrinth gut, tamed yet alive, like a heartbeat the realm had learned to keep. Okay. Bendy. Winter broke that year with the snap of a siege bowstring. One day dawn crept in pale and tremulous on the wings of whistling swans. The next, it slammed shut, behind a wall of iron sky that spat sleet at roofs and bent merchant cypresses into arthritic bows. Ice locked the black water in sluggish plates, and put a thin ghost sheen on every flagstone of the city. But the thousand-arched tidebreaker rumbled on beneath the surface like some titanic furnace heart. Even in warmth-starved taverns, Folk spoke of the towers as though they were keepers of a broader pulse, guardians against calamities that might stalk the world while most of its people slept snug behind shutters and hearthstones. On the first morning after the freeze, Toman Two Lines rose from his pallet in the Builders' Guild Hall and watched his breath plume white in the half-lit dormitory. 36 other apprentices were stuffing straw into boots, wrapping scarves, grumbling without heat, yet none went for a furnace poker until Toman pointed. A single glance from him sent 2 lads scurrying to the coal cellar, and the moment he heard the great roar he knew how much sway Sanders' teaching still carried. Authority vested not by rank alone, but by the instinct for action in service of common warmth. He tugged on his patched wool coat and headed into the snow-fogged streets with ink and draft tubes strapped to his back, the resin-matched keepsake clicking softly inside his breast pocket. He had been summoned at dawn by Marshal Brienne herself, a 2-sentence raven scratch that read simply, "Meet me at the 4 Terrace Gate. Bring volume 7 and a practical mind." Toman slid the book into a waterproof sleeve. He had copied it in his own blocky hand, refusing a scribe's finesse for want of owning every line. He glimpsed scribbled margin notes Arya had added the previous week, amended beam angles for ice loads, essential calculations for bracing arches when frozen water expanded patterns unforeseen. He hurried on, following footprints crusted in fresh powder. Brienne waited under the high Barbican arch, a silhouette of matte steel and wool against white glare. Her hair gleamed silver where it had never known gold, and even the scarf at her throat was Tarth blue, not Kin's red. Snow hunkered on her pauldrons, melting as she stepped into motion. Behind her horses stamped, harness bells muffled with wrapped felt. "Bring only 1 bag." "Cheating? We'll ride light. 2 days north to Saladhor's Poise, then on to Fairmarket. Ice dams burst on the Blue Fork. I've asked for corp eyes." Toman pictured Fairmarket's twin bridges, the timber trading span, and the older stone arched road. He had traced them from vellum impressions, but never walked them. "Old pilings were oak," he said, half to himself, half in greeting. "Ice'll chew them like boar-gnawed corn. Then we'll teach Fairmarket how to outchew ice." Brienne mounted, offering him the opposite stirrup. The ride became a crucible, air so sharp it whittled cheekbones raw. Drifts piled head-high in road cuts, the wind from the Trident's Valley howling like something newly wounded. At night, they bivouacked, under the lee of abandoned wheelwrights' huts, eating trail oats boiled in snow-melt spice by Brienne's dwindling stash of Storm Island pepper. Toman slept light, shoulder aching in the cold, but he dreamed heavy, of stone that cracked with a cannon-bleak report, of floodwater black with winter silt sweeping barns and children away, of bridges that snapped like toffee under unstoppable white mountains grinding downstream. He woke each dawn with volume 7 in hand, renewing calculations. Fairmarket crouched at the confluence like a wounded talon, wings of river ice crumpled around its timber yards. Smoke rose from the town in thin, desperate ribbons. The stone bridge, built centuries earlier on dragonback-arched foundations, still stood, though slabs of ice hammered its piers like siege rams. The timber span had not fared half so well. One mid-channel pier had sheared, letting 2 bays hang twisted, planks dangling like sinew. Merchants carried goods over the stone road now, bottling traffic, price gouging rising. A gong tolled when the marshal's banners, simple crossed hammers, breached the snowy hedgerow. Town alderman appeared, shivering inside fur, speaking of floodwater when thaw came, of backlog cargo spoiling in cold holds. Brienne dispatched courtesy quickly. They walked onto the battered timber span, Toman trailing a pace behind. He knelt, brushing snow away, feeling the shudder of current, even slowed by ice, to judge weight. "River is dammed upstream," he said after a moment. "When melt breaks, every flow will ride this chute straight into your stone pilings. The arch will survive if scoured, but the roadway above might crack. Worse, the timber stumps will ricochet whole bergs into town walls." Alderman Brigg, whose jowls shook with each breath, swallowed. "We have no men to cut channels, no saws that can chew ice thick as 4 men's arms." Brienne's answer was the Greyhound Corps. She flagged a courier falcon, and within half a day 6 riding columns appeared. Men and women carrying frame saws, wedges, black powder casks sealed with pitch. Taman oversaw rigging. Ropes stretched from surviving piers, pulleys anchored to ox-hauled windlasses on either quay. At twilight they drilled boreholes into the ice dam upstream. Neat rows plotted from Volume 7's table, on yield fractures in frozen water. Charges placed, a line of fuse soaked in distilled spirit to keep it pliable. The blast at dawn was felt, not heard, like the sudden intake of a gigantic breath. Ice plates jumped, cracks snapped, and a monstrous groan shuddered through the valley as the dam gave, belching broken shards downstream. But the Corps had already half-felled the timber wreckage. They guided floes through a slalom of rope-rigged boom arms, into the floodplain south of town where water could spread. Brienne rode knee-deep in freezing foam, calling commands steady as church bells. Taman balanced on the stone bridge parapet, marking loads with chalk, sending runners to tighten braces as pressure peaked. For 4 hours the river raged. For 4 hours stone held and timber fragments funneled harmlessly past. When flood passed noonward, Fairmarket breathed again. Merchants clustered to praise marshal and boy architect, promising casks of spiced red. But Brienne waved it aside with exhaustion-soft eyes. "Keep the wine. Warm your homeless instead." She turned to Taman. "We sail for salt pans at first thaw. South Fork levees show signs of burrowing, marmots likely. Could undermine footings. Then now one day." He opened his mouth to accept, but staggered. Blood dripped from his old shoulder wound, reopened by the day's strain. Brienne steadied him. "You'll sail after the healer's tourniquet, and not before." That night, Tommen lay in Alderman Briggs' guest loft, shoulder bandaged, feeling rivers pound behind eyes. He could not sleep. Footsteps creaked downstairs, slow, light, yet sure. A shape came to the loft door, candle behind revealing a slight figure in quilted jacket. Arya died. Nymeria's head appeared around her hip, eyes ember-sharp. "You follow fast," Tommen said. "Cor sent Raven for extra saw teeth." She crossed the threshold and shut wind out. "You nearly let the river take your stitches, I hear." He managed a rueful grin. Volume 7, Lax, chapter on restraint. Write 1. She set a parcel of parchment by his bedside. New notes. Brienne's idea for arch culverts beneath tree root zones. Draft them once stitches hold? He reached but winced. Arya took his hand, gripped it for a moment. "Sandor never stopped when hurt," he whispered. "Sandor died of a heart that beat itself to rags." She replied, "Gaze hard. Live longer. Build more. Da." Nymeria exhaled a low chuff like approval. Arya released his hand, ghosted out. He stared at the parchment bundle, then slept heavier than any night since river rides. Across the seas, the Sarnori remnant fumed. Their Blackwater gambit had failed, their coffers drained. Yet failure bred cunning. They shifted aim from rivers to grain. Specifically to the seed grain shipments from the reach that sustained 60% of Crownland's urban bread in lean winters. They purchased weevilled stock from a disgruntled Casterly middleman, ground it into dust, mixed it with a Roynish blight spore that thrived on oat and barley, and bagged it in sacks, stamped with roses of Highgarden. They bribed caravanners to spread rumors of shortages, guaranteeing townsfolk would scramble for early seed. The wagons rolled north in late frost, disguised as charitable shipments for greening fields. 2 reached King's Landing. A third veered through Fairmarket, where Tommen still supervised repair to the timber span. He spotted mold flecks around a sack stitch, recognized spore patties like those from Citadel plague scrolls. He halted the entire convoy with a single call. Guards grumbled, until Arya appeared from nowhere, blade balanced idly on finger, expression promising questions they would not want answered. Testing revealed infestation. Corps scribes quarantined the shipment in a lime pit outside town, but rumors of tainted reach grain seeped into taverns faster than any quarantine. Panic buying flared in city markets. Grain prices spiked. Speculators hoarded. Brienne rushed home to discover breadlines at dawn and whispers that the circle could not keep bellies full. Someone stoked those fears with printed broadsheets claiming the tidebreaker had cost so much coin there was none left for wheat. The circle convened emergency session. Brienne pounded the gavel so hard the oak cracked. "We will not let shadows rule," she warned. They deployed truth as counter-weapon. Taman drafted handbills showing storehouse inventories. Arya read aloud at street corners, the ledger lines of grain still flowing on wyverns' tail barges. Yet chaos lingers where hunger lurks, and one night a mob stormed storehouses near the dragon pit. Tinder in hand, Corps volunteers formed a human barrier. Torches were thrown. Flames licked old stone. Taman arrived with a squad dragging pump wagons. Arya sprinted along ramparts, cutting arsonists' ropes, tackling a youth no older than she'd once been on King's Road with Sandor. "Bread tomorrow or ashes tonight," she barked, yanking him away from fire. Fear sobered him. He fled. Pumps hissed. Storehouses survived. But smoke filled Royal Quarter and coughed reality into the lungs of every circle member. Grain security was as critical as flood walls and tide towers. The circle voted to create a winter grain conservancy. 40 inland silos ringed the crownlands like a necklace, each silo mandated to keep 6 months' seed under gray-hand lock. Taman had mapped locations. Chalky ridges safe from flood, near clay pits for brick. Construction started midsummer. Brienne oversaw contracts. Arya roved site to site, sparing nights to teach sling drills to local farmers so they could defend silos if war returned. Taman drafted design after design. Conical tile roofs shedding snow, interior cross-vent plenum to keep mold at bay, deep stone skirts proofed against root burrow pests. Each silo door bore Sandor's carven shield, plain-crossed hammer and trowel. Within a year, gray towers peppered fields like watchful giants. Grain flowed in, catalogued by scribes, sealed with wax. Prices eased. A child born that harvest would never remember hungry days that had nearly come. But the old powers did not rest. Lords ousted from influence by the circle's common rule had gathered first in resentment, then in secret halls. They whispered of a return to simpler hierarchies, where coin and birthright carved the world. They named themselves the Iron Concord, barons of minor houses, merchant princes bruised by tariff equalization, disinherited sons who craved a throne no longer. They recruited sellsword captains hungry for plunder withheld by stable law. Half of the gold company now patrolled Essos estates jobless. The Concord promised spoils, grain from silos, coin from tide tolls, prestige of overthrowing a mason's republic. They amassed arms on the Southland coast near Crackclaw, building fires in hush of kelp-laden coves. Their plan: strike at midwinter when the Corps spread across 6 provinces would struggle to muster. Take King's Landing, seize grain, hold the circle hostage. They cultivated sympathizers inside the city's old guilds, men nostalgic for days when guildmaster words were second only to King's decree. These plants would open posterns, sabotage the tide sluice shutters to send ice surge straight to inner wall. A betrayal of brick and brine. Arya smelled wind shift first, rumors of sellsword banners glimpsed by Turtle Bay, an uptick of black market rope purchase, none definitive. Brienne trusted instinct. She recalled Jaime's musings on whispers before war. She summoned Taman and Arya to the rotunda, one freezing dusk. World is built on edges, she began, voice quiet. We live in balance while axes grind to cut the beam. Concord gathers out there. I would call banners, but Circle holds no standing army. She tapped the table. We have only builders. Taman's gaze drifted to Volume 1's motto, carved into room lintel. Then we build a defense out of stone at hand. Stone might be traitor's heart, Arya countered. Posterns can open from inside with one blade. Then we build hearts loyal, Tommen returned, surprising himself with ferocity. We show every guildmaster who shelters under stable walls what world drops if those walls break. He looked to Brienne. Let me speak to them. So it came that the scar-shouldered architect stood before a convocation of guild elders in the candle-gloomed amphitheater beneath the great sept. Men and women older, richer, more cynical than any crowd had addressed. He wore no fine cloak, only builder's coat, white with mortar dust. Nymeria prowled dark aisles, silent sentinel. Arya watched unseen. Tommen spoke not of politics but of numbers. How tide towers funneled tax savings into fish market dredging, how silos saved the brewer's rye, how volume of stone purchased for levee buttressing yielded profit to quarrymen fivefold. He held up the resin-match reliquary, telling of hellstone barrels that might have burned them all but for vigilance born of shared stewardship. Then he dropped the reliquary. It clattered, rolled, but did not crack. Our realm is like this shard of flame, he said, bound by clear walls. We can keep passing it safely, or watch it smash open and burn everything because we doubted those walls. Then so. Some scoffed. Some looked stricken. He produced ledgers of Concord purchases, salt pork orders for siege rations, crossbolt crates mis-stenciled as olive oil. Proof enough. Murmurs spread, uncertainty cracking. He left them with Sanders' last directive etched on the slab: stand between fire and flesh. That night, the guilds declared neutrality in any uprising. Many pledged manpower to reinforce sewers. The Concord hoped to infiltrate. Core teams sealed posterns with iron bars cast on site, hidden behind false stone finishes that only Tommen's masons could unseat. Concord's strike came early thaw, moonless, tide ebbing. 3 skirmish wings landed at Mud Gate, hoping to sabotage sluices. They found archers from Mummer's Guild perched on rooftop perches. A second force tunneled into quayside cisterns, but emerged into pits flooded to the neck. Corps engineers had diverted drains hours before. Brienne rode squadron of Baker militia, rolling pin shields, salt loaf maces, right through center ranks, driving them into fisherfolk nets strung across alley. Arya captured the Concord paymaster by dropping from a laundry awning onto his horse, dislocating his shoulder with her knee. Dawn revealed less a battle than a foiled burglary. Losses, minimal. The city awoke, learned what might have been, and realized how close it had crept to the old ages of warring crowns. Concord leaders were tried by Circle Tribunal, not for treason, which would have raised old noble martyrs, but for sabotage of civic works, a crime defined clearly in Volume 3's Annex. Sentences: 20 years labor on levee expansions, no blood spilled. Brienne declared, your strength dug holes, now fill them. For Arya, the trial ended nothing. She roamed streets nights after, senses pricked for leftover rot. She found one, a ledger at a guild hall listing under-the-table payments to Coastal Crane Co-op, seemingly innocuous. She took it to Tommen. Together they traced shell company ties to Sarnori accounts. Grain, Hellstone, now sabotage, threads all leading back to Sarnori's seat of power. The ancient city of Salosh, where river once met sea in bronze-carved canals now half-silt. Brienne would not sanction covert, overseas strikes. The Circle's charter forbade foreign wars, except by unanimous guild consent. A steep cliff. Arya chose another way. Volunteer sabbatical. She and Tommen would sail disguised as trading surveyors, verify Sarnori capacity for future threats, choke roots before poison bore fruit. Brienne's jaw clenched, but she signed off. On one condition: they take a corpse detachment of 15 and return within 6 months. The voyage east took them beyond the familiar hum of stepstones into deeper currents. Tommen spent deck hours drafting wave energy converters. A fantasy maybe, yet storms churned here with malicious variants. He imagined floating caissons to harness that power for lighthouse beacons. Arya sparred nightly with deckhands honing speed. Nymeria slept on hatch cover. Smelling brine. Landfall at Salosh shocked them. Canals clogged with rustweed. Towers leaning drunk on foundations cracked. Yet marketplace bustled. A trade of scrap bronze, coal brick, and hush-hush goods. They disguised themselves as buyers of limestone block, touring warehouses. What they found: hidden kilns forging tin sleeves for hellstone casks, sealed tunnels lined with pitch, row upon row. The Sarnori were scaling, not retracting. Corps scouts mapped 5 depots. Plan: simultaneous sabotage, breach pitch drains, flood kilns with seawater on night tide. Timing hinged on tide tables, Toman scribbled from moon reading. Arya led strike team. He set charges of clay tamped around sluice grates. At high tide they cracked grates. Seawater roared, quenching furnaces in steam bursts. Carcinogenic fumes billowed. Workers fled. Yet chaos unveiled deeper horror. A partially loaded barge already in canal, drifting from Central Depot. Casks stacked 3 high, likely bound for Mirror Trading Lane. Arya sprinted along quay, leapt onto deck. 2 guards drew scimitars. She skewered one through thigh, kicked other overboard. But a deckhand lit a lantern, shrieking threat to torch casks. Toman, arriving breathless, seized a mooring pike, flung it overhead. It struck lantern, smashing flame into water. Lantern died. Deckhand froze, eyes wide. Nymeria snarled from dock rope. The man surrendered. They guided barge into scuttle basin, where Corps flooded hold, sealing casks forever in silt. But alarm spread. City militia rallied. Corps volunteers fought retreating skirmishes through alley canals, ducking crossbow bolts. At Long Shadow Bridge, Toman fell, struck by ricochet splinter. Arya dragged him into a fishmonger stall. Staunched blood with salted eel skin. Bizarre but effective. Their ship, hidden in Marshmouth, set sail 2 nights later with tide. Salash smoked behind like a smothered wasp nest, production crippled. Yet Arya's eyes remained reservoirs of storm. If Salash rebuilds, she murmured to Toman on deck, we return again, and again. He nodded, but weariness crept in. The exhaustion of a builder tasked with endless tearing down of what others built for ruin. Sandor had spoken lightly of leaving hammers to youngsters. Toman now realized what burden that phrase disguised. They returned to King's Landing in early spring. Cherry petals gusted across streets. The Hill of Rainies bustled with families visiting the pergola, teaching children to read names carved into oak beams. Toman walked there alone first night back, shoulder tight from healing. He knelt by granite block, touched hammer half. Tried to mend world again, he whispered. Keep me swinging. Some warmth, wind or memory, moved across his cheek. He rose, ready. The circle greeted them with cheers and new dilemmas. Southern drought shrank the Mander. Old Town petitioned for designs to lift water from lower cataracts. Toman unrolled sketches of screw pump towers, powered by tethered kites, catching sea breeze. Arya volunteered to head test site. Brienne chuckled. I see our next decade's work. But that night, the marshal convened small council. Arya, Toman, Lesatide, Garen Clay. She laid out a parchment bearing rough globe. Trade winds, volcanic belts, fracture zones. Storms, quakes, drought. They will come. We cannot chase each alone forever. We must look farther. Toman frowned. Beyond realm. Beyond this age. She tapped parchment. A grand school. Not for nobles or builders only. A place where every child can learn weather science. Stonecraft, crop cycles, languages of far coasts. A mind tidebreaker. Silence held, pregnant, potent. Arya's face lit slowly. Where? On the ridge above Maidenpool. Stone ground. Symbolic. Toman's chest tightened. An academy. A fortress of knowledge built where Greyhand once levered a broken wagon. He pictured halls shaped by arch mathematics, windows oriented to solstice sun, workshops ringing with chisels and laughter. He whispered, name it for him. Brienne shook head gently. He would scowl. We'll name it for the work, the builder's confluence, but on cornerstone we'll etch his creed. They clasped arms, a circle inside circle, and thus blueprint for next great structure took root. Construction began that summer. Granite from Rosby, cedar rafters from Bear Island barged down coast, glass panes blown in stained hues by Dornish artisans. The site overlooked storm-shattered bluff and tranquil harbor, a lesson in contrasts for every pupil. Corps volunteers labored beside journeyman carpenters. No whip cracked, songs rose. Taman oversaw geometry. Arya trained local youths to sling rubble clear. Brienne visited weekly, advising but never commanding, leadership through presence. One dawn, as first lecture hall buttress locked into keystone, Tommen noticed cracks spidering across his resin-match reliquary. It had borne many journeys. Salt had leached binding. He meant to set it aside, but impulse guided him to embed it within the foundation mortar at threshold. He pressed it beneath arch springer, sealing flame inside stone forever, a talisman none but he would know. When at last the confluence opened, 3,000 gathered, farmers, smiths, tailors, sailors, children clutching slates. Brienne spoke briefly, then led them across threshold. Banners hung, each showing crossed hammer and compass. In central atrium, a bronze statue stood. Not Sandor nor any hero, but two hands, one burnt, one unscarred, passing a trowel between. Tommen wound through corridors hearing first lessons, measuring lengths of shadow to gauge noon, forging nails of varying carbon to test brittleness, reciting the rhyme of flame. He climbed outer stairs to roof garden where Arya leaned on balustrade, breeze tugging dark hair. "Still restless?" he asked. "Always." She eyed the horizon. "Yet this feels anchor enough." He followed her gaze, tidebreaker towers like distant sentinels, silos dotting plains, levee lines glinting. People moved among them like ants weaving gold. He realized the endless repairs formed a tapestry, each patch deeper binding. Nymeria padded up, nose to his hand, then turned to path leading down to orchard where children laughed. Wolf and children, two worlds once more at odds, now met in peace. Tommen thought of Sandor, of a burnt man who became builder through pain, and found his eyes stinging. He let the emotion stand unhidden. A bell rang in atrium, first lecture for advanced culvert hydraulics. Arya pushed away from rail. "Shall we?" "We must," he said. They descended shoulder to shoulder, footsteps echoing new stones, each step a promise. The work continued.